When Nathaniel Cole rode into Copper Hollow after 8 years, he came home to a mother already buried and a life he'd abandoned. But at her graveside, he found the one woman who could make him believe in second chances. This is a story about losing everything to find what truly matters. Stay with me until the end, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The horse beneath Nathaniel Cole was bone-tired, and so was the man. 3 days of hard riding had brought them from the Montana plains to the edge of Copper Hollow, Arizona territory, and neither had much left to give. The gelding's coat was dark with sweat despite the cool November air, its breathing labored and heavy. Nathaniel's own body ached in places he'd forgotten could hurt. His lower back a constant throb, his thighs chafed raw from the saddle, his hands blistered even through his leather gloves. But none of that compared to the weight in his chest. The telegram was still in his pocket, folded and refolded so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth. He didn't need to read it again. Every word was burned into his memory. Mother passed Tuesday morning, funeral Saturday. Come home. Reverend Thomas. 4 days ago, that telegram had found him in a dusty mining camp outside Butte. By the time he'd settled his debts, gathered his things, and started riding, his mother had already been in the ground for 2 days. He was too late. Again. The thought sat in his stomach like a stone as Copper Hollow came into view through the cottonwoods. The town hadn't changed much in 8 years. Same weathered buildings clustered around the main street, same white church steeple rising above them like an accusing finger pointing toward heaven. The afternoon sun painted everything in shades of amber and rust, beautiful in that particular way the Arizona high country got in autumn, when the air turned crisp and the light seemed to come from some older, kinder world. Nathaniel pulled the horse to a stop at the top of the ridge and sat there, looking down at the place he'd sworn he'd never see again. His hands were shaking. He gripped the reins tighter, but that only made it worse, so he let them rest loose against the saddle horn and tried to breathe. The air smelled like wood smoke and pine, and the particular mineral scent of the creek that ran along the eastern edge of town. It smelled like every memory he'd spent 8 years trying to outrun. "Well, Blue," he said quietly to the horse, "this is it. Home sweet home." The gelding flicked an ear back at his voice but didn't move, clearly content to stand there as long as his rider wanted. Nathaniel appreciated that about horses. They didn't ask questions. They didn't judge. They just carried you wherever you needed to go, even if you weren't sure you wanted to get there. He was 31 years old, though he felt twice that. 8 years of drifting, ranch work in Wyoming, cattle drives through Colorado, a stint as a deputy in New Mexico that had ended badly, time in the mining camps when money got tight. 8 years of waking up in different towns, different bunks, different lives that never quite fit. 8 years of telling himself he'd made the right choice the night he'd saddled his horse and ridden away from Copper Hollow with nothing but the clothes on his back and rage in his heart. Now his mother was dead, and he hadn't been there. Not at the end. Not when it mattered. The guilt was so heavy he could hardly breathe around it. Nathaniel finally urged Blue forward, down the slope toward town. The gelding picked its way carefully along the familiar trail. Nathaniel was surprised his body remembered the path, his legs and hands adjusting automatically to the terrain. How many times had he ridden this exact route as a boy? 100? 1,000? They passed the old Hendricks place, which looked more decrepit than ever, the barn sagging in the middle like a swayback horse. Then the Morrison Ranch, where cattle grazed in fields that seemed smaller than he remembered. Everything seemed smaller, actually, as if the town had shrunk in his absence, or maybe he'd just built it up so large in his mind that reality could never match the memory. As they reached the edge of Main Street, Nathaniel tugged his hat lower, not ready yet for the recognition he knew would come. But it was late afternoon on a Thursday, and the street was quiet. A few horses tied at the mercantile, a wagon outside the feed store, nothing much else. He was grateful for that small mercy. He rode straight through town toward the road that led to the Cole property. 300 acres of high country rangeland with good water and better grass, land his grandfather had claimed in 1858, and his father had worked until it nearly worked him to death. The homestead sat 2 miles west of town, nestled in a valley where Pine Creek ran year-round, and the mountains rose up like sentinels on three sides. The gate was still there, weathered but standing, and Nathaniel dismounted to open it, his legs stiff and unsteady after so many hours in the saddle. The hinges squealed. Nobody had oiled them in years by the sound of it. He led Blue through and closed the gate behind them, then stood there for a moment, one hand still on the rough wood, looking up the long drive toward the house. It was a simple place, the Cole homestead. The main house was built from local stone and timber, solid but not fancy, with a wide porch across the front and a stone chimney at one end. There was the barn, which looked like it needed repairs, and the smaller outbuildings scattered around. The spring house, the smokehouse, the chicken coop that probably hadn't seen chickens in years. The corrals were empty, the fences sagging. Everything looked tired, neglected, alone. Nathaniel's throat tightened as he swung back into the saddle and rode up the drive. The windows of the house were dark, and the porch, his mother's porch, where she'd sat so many evenings shelling peas or mending clothes or just watching the sun go down, was empty except for the rocking chair she'd loved, still there like it was waiting for her to come back. She wouldn't, though. She was gone, and he hadn't said goodbye. He dismounted at the hitching post and tied Blue there, though the horse was too tired to wander. For a moment, Nathaniel just stood with his hand on the gelding's neck, gathering himself. Then he forced his feet to move up the 3 steps to the porch, across the worn boards to the front door. It was unlocked. Of course it was. His mother had never locked doors. The interior was dim and cool, smelling of dust and closed-up spaces. Nathaniel stepped inside and removed his hat, holding it in both hands like a shield. The front room looked exactly as he remembered. The same furniture, the same rag rugs on the floor, the same pictures on the walls, his grandmother's clock on the mantel, his mother's sewing basket beside her chair, the Bible on the side table, its leather cover worn soft with use. Everything was the same, everything except the person who mattered most. "Hello?" His voice came out rough, and he cleared his throat. "Anyone here?" Silence. He hadn't really expected an answer, but the emptiness of it still hit him hard. Nathaniel moved through the rooms slowly, each one a catalog of loss. The kitchen where his mother had taught him to make biscuits when he was 6 years old, the hallway where height marks for him and his brother were still visible on the doorframe. Samuel's stopped at age 12, the year the fever took him. His parents' bedroom, with the bed made neatly and his father's things still on the dresser, as if James Cole might walk in any moment, though he'd been dead 3 years now. And finally, his own room, at the back of the house. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. It was like walking into a tomb. Everything was exactly as he'd left it the night he ran away. The bed still unmade from his hasty departure, his old clothes still hanging on pegs, books on the shelf, the wooden horse Samuel had carved for him when they were boys still sitting on the windowsill. His mother hadn't changed a thing. For 8 years, she'd kept this room like a shrine, waiting for him to come home. Now she never would know that he had. Nathaniel sat down on the edge of the bed, still holding his hat, and felt something break inside him. The tears came hot and fierce, and he didn't fight them. There was nobody here to see, nobody to judge, just him and all the ghosts of the life he'd abandoned. He cried for his mother, who died without him, for his brother, gone too soon, for his father, even though they'd parted in anger, for the boy he'd been and the man he'd become. A drifter, a wanderer. Someone who belonged nowhere because he'd walked away from the one place he'd ever belonged. When the tears finally stopped, Nathaniel felt hollowed out, empty as the house around him. He wiped his face with his sleeve and stood up, his body aching from the ride and the grief both. He needed to see to his horse. Then he needed to figure out what came next. He walked back outside, and the late afternoon sun was golden and gentle, at odds with everything inside him. Blue was standing 3-legged at the post, dozing. Nathaniel untied him and led him to the barn, which was dim and dusty inside but structurally sound. There was hay in the loft. Someone had been maintaining the place, at least minimally. He unsaddled Blue, rubbed him down with a relatively clean rag, and gave him hay and water from the pump. "There you go, boy," he said softly, running a hand down the horse's nose. "You earned it." When he emerged from the barn, the sun was lower, painting the mountains in shades of purple and rose. Nathaniel stood in the yard looking around at the property with new eyes, the eyes of a man who might have to decide what to do with it. Sell it? Keep it? He had no idea. He'd never planned to come back here. He'd never planned for any of this. He was halfway back to the house when he heard it, the sound of a wagon coming up the drive. Nathaniel turned, his hand dropping instinctively toward his hip, where a gun would have been if he'd been wearing one, but he'd packed his revolver in his saddlebags. No need to ride into town armed like he was expecting trouble. Still, old habits died hard, and his body tensed as the wagon came into view. It was a simple buckboard pulled by a single horse, driven by a woman. She was alone, and as the wagon drew closer, Nathaniel could see she was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark blonde hair pinned up under a simple bonnet and a plain blue dress that marked her as respectable but not wealthy. Her face was serious, focused on the road, but there was something gentle in it too, something that made him think of morning light through clean windows. She pulled the wagon to a stop about 20 feet from where he stood and looked at him with eyes that were the color of creek water over stone, gray-green and clear and direct. "Mr. Cole?" she said, and her voice was softer than he'd expected, but steady. "Nathaniel Cole?" "That's right." His voice came out more cautious than he meant it to. "Do I know you?" "No, sir. We've never met." She wrapped the reins around the brake handle and climbed down from the wagon with practiced ease, smoothing her skirts. "My name is Clara Bennett. I'm Dr. Bennett's daughter." The name clicked into place. Doc Bennett. I remember him. Good man. "Was," she said quietly. "He passed 2 years ago." "I'm sorry to hear that." She nodded, accepting the condolence, then moved to the back of the wagon. "I brought some things for you. Food, mostly. Some other supplies you might need." Nathaniel moved closer, surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She was already lifting a large basket from the wagon bed, and Nathaniel stepped forward quickly to take it from her. It was heavy, packed with bread, preserves, what looked like a ham wrapped in cloth, vegetables, other things he couldn't identify. "But your mother was kind to me, Mr. Cole. Very kind. This is the least I can do." Something in her voice when she said that, "Your mother was kind to me," made Nathaniel look at her more closely. There was a story there, he could tell. Something more than just neighborly acquaintance. "Did you know her well?" he asked, setting the basket on the porch steps. Clara Bennett was already reaching for another box in the wagon. "I did. These last 2 years especially, I came out here twice a week, sometimes more toward the end, to help with things. The heavier chores, the garden, just company. She was alone out here after your father passed. I didn't think that was right." The words were matter of fact, not accusatory, but Nathaniel felt the sting of them anyway. She was alone, and he'd left her that way. "There's more," Clara said, apparently not noticing or choosing not to notice the effect her words had on him. "I didn't know when you'd arrive, so I packed enough for several days. The bread's fresh this morning. The ham should keep in the spring house if you need it to. There's butter and eggs, potatoes from the last of the fall harvest, green beans I put up in August. Your mother loved those, and some of Mrs. Morrison's apple pie, because she insisted." Nathaniel helped her unload the rest, box after box and basket after basket, far more food than one man could eat in a week. It spoke to something, the town's regard for his mother, maybe, or their pity for the prodigal son. He wasn't sure which bothered him more. When everything was unloaded and stacked on the porch, Clara brushed off her hands and looked up at him. She was tall for a woman, maybe 5'7", but Nathaniel still had half a foot on her. In the fading light, her face was all clean lines and quiet strength, not beautiful in the showy way some women were, but handsome, solid, real. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It's no trouble." She glanced toward the house, then back at him. "The funeral was Saturday. A good service. The whole town came. Reverend Thomas spoke well of her, and there were flowers, so many flowers. She's buried in the cemetery next to your father and Samuel. I thought you'd want to know." Nathaniel's throat was too tight to speak for a moment. He managed a nod. Clara seemed to understand. She didn't push, didn't try to fill the silence with empty words. Instead, she moved back toward the wagon, and Nathaniel found his voice. Miss Bennet, Clara, wait. She turned back, her expression patient. You said you were with her. These last 2 years. Did she suffer? It was the question that had haunted him every mile of the ride home. The telegram had said nothing about how she died, just that she was gone, and his imagination had conjured every horrible possibility. Clara's face softened. No, she said gently. It was her heart, Mr. Cole. Dr. Pritchard, he took over my father's practice, said it just gave out. She went to sleep on Monday night and didn't wake Tuesday morning. It was peaceful, I promise you that. The relief was so intense it nearly buckled his knees. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for telling me. She talked about you, Clara said, and now there was something else in her voice. Not judgment, but maybe a question. Often, she hoped you'd come home someday. The guilt crashed back over him like a wave. I meant to, he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I always meant to. There was never a right time, and then more time passed, and it got harder, and He trailed off, the excuses sounding hollow even to his own ears. Clara watched him with those clear gray-green eyes, and he had the uncomfortable feeling she could see right through him, down to all the broken, cowardly places he tried to hide. But all she said was, She understood, Mr. Cole. Whatever happened between you and your father, whatever reason you had for leaving, she understood, and she forgave you. I hope you can forgive yourself. Then she climbed back into the wagon, released the brake, and turned the horse around. Wait, Nathaniel called again. Will I see you? At church, maybe, or in town? She looked back at him, and something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or curiosity. I expect so. Copper Hollow's not a big place. Hard to avoid people even when you want to. I don't want to, he said, then felt his face heat at how that sounded. I mean, I'd like to thank you properly, for what you did for my mother, for this. He gestured at the food on the porch. Claire's expression softened into something that might have been a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. You're welcome, Mr. Cole. Get some rest. You look like you need it. Then she clicked to the horse and drove away, the wagon wheels crunching on the gravel drive, leaving Nathaniel standing alone in the gathering dusk with more questions than he'd started with. Who was Clara Bennet, really? What had his mother meant to her? And why did the thought of seeing her again make something in his chest feel lighter than it had in years? He had no answers, only the food on the porch, the empty house behind him, and the long, lonely night ahead. Nathaniel carried the baskets and boxes inside, storing the perishables in the spring house as Clara had suggested. The cold water running through it kept things fresh, and he was grateful for the foresight. When everything was put away, he made himself a simple supper, bread and butter and some of the ham, though he had no appetite, and sat at the kitchen table where his mother had sat 10,000 times. The silence was oppressive. The clock ticked. The house settled. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window frames. After he'd forced down as much food as he could manage, Nathaniel cleaned up and wandered through the house again, looking for what? Signs of her. Evidence that she'd thought of him? Proof that he'd been wrong to stay away so long? In her bedroom, on the small table beside the bed, he found a stack of letters tied with a ribbon. His letters. Every one he'd sent over the 8 years, and there hadn't been many, maybe a dozen in all, carefully kept and preserved. He picked up the stack with shaking hands and saw that she'd written dates on the outside of each envelope. The last one was from almost 2 years ago. He hadn't written since. God, what kind of son was he? Nathaniel put the letters back and opened the drawer of the bedside table. Inside was a Bible, well-worn and marked with ribbons. Her reading glasses. A handkerchief with her initials embroidered in one corner. He remembered doing that for her when he was 10. The stitches crooked and uneven, and she'd cried and said it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever made for her. And underneath everything, a sealed envelope with his name on it in her handwriting. His hands were shaking again as he picked it up. The paper was crisp, the ink fresh. This had been written recently, maybe in her last days or last hours. Maybe she'd known, somehow, that the end was coming. Nathaniel carried the letter back to the kitchen where the light was better and sat down at the table. For a long moment he just held it, afraid of what it might say, afraid it would blame him, afraid it wouldn't. Finally, he broke the seal and unfolded the pages, 3 of them, covered front and back in her neat, careful script. My dearest Nathaniel, if you're reading this, then I've gone on ahead, and you've come home at last. I'm glad for that, even if I wish I could have seen you one more time with these old eyes. But God's timing is His own, and I trust in His plan, even when I don't understand it. First, I want you to know that I love you. I have always loved you, from the moment you were born to this very moment and beyond. Nothing you've done or haven't done could ever change that. You are my son, my boy, and you carry my heart with you wherever you roam. Second, I want to tell you that I'm not angry you left. I was never angry, Nathaniel. Sad, yes. I missed you every day. But angry? No, I knew why you went. I knew what your father said to you that night, and I knew you couldn't stay. You were so much like him, stubborn and proud and fierce, and when 2 bulls lock horns, someone has to give way. You were younger, so you left. I understand that. Your father understood it too, eventually. Before he died, we talked about you many times. He regretted the things he said. He regretted driving you away. He was too proud to write and tell you that. You got that stubborn streak from him, I'm afraid. But I'm telling you now. James Cole loved his son, even if he had a poor way of showing it. Third, I want to talk to you about forgiveness. You need to forgive your father for being the hard, difficult man he was. You need to forgive yourself for leaving. And you need to forgive life for not turning out the way you planned. Carrying bitterness is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. It will kill you from the inside, Nathaniel. Don't let it. Now about practical matters. The ranch is yours, free and clear. I've left everything to you. The land, the house, what money there is. Not much, I'm afraid, but enough to keep you going for a while. Mr. Henderson at the bank has all the papers. Do with it what you will. Sell it and move on, or stay and build something. Either choice is fine, as long as it's what you truly want. But Nathaniel, before you decide, I want you to give Copper Hollow a real chance. Not the place you ran from 8 years ago, but the place it is now. Get to know the people again. Let them know you. This town, these people, they're good folks, and they could use a strong man like you've become. And speaking of good people, I want to tell you about Clara Bennett. If she's the one who gave you this letter, then you've already met her. She's been my dearest friend these past 2 years, a true gift from God. She's been coming out here twice a week or more, helping with everything I couldn't manage on my own anymore. She never asked for payment or thanks. She just came because she's got a good heart. Clara is a special woman, Nathaniel. She's been through her own sorrows, lost her husband just 6 months after they married, lost her father not long after that. But she didn't let it make her bitter. She turned it into compassion instead. She became the town's unofficial nurse, helping Dr. Pritchard, tending to sick folks, sitting with the dying. She's got healing hands and a generous soul. I'm not trying to matchmake, son. I'm just telling you that if you're looking for reasons to stay in Copper Hollow, Clara Bennett is a good one. Not because she needs saving, she doesn't, but because she's the kind of woman who makes a place feel like home. I'm getting tired now and my hand is shaking, so I'll close soon. But I want to leave you with this. You are not too late, Nathaniel. Not for life, not for love, not for building something that matters. You've been running for 8 years and I understand why, but it's time to stop. It's time to find where you belong and put down roots. I hope that place is here. I hope you choose to stay, to take over the ranch, to become part of this community again. But if you can't, if you need to keep moving, then go with my blessing. Just promise me you'll stop running from things and start moving towards something. Promise me you'll find a place and a person worth staying for. I love you, my son. I'm proud of the man you've become, even though I didn't get to see it happen. Be good. Be kind. Be brave. And when you think of me, don't think of the end. Think of the good times. Think of you and Samuel racing horses across the meadow. Think of Christmas mornings and Sunday dinners. Think of the day you were born, and I held you for the first time, and I knew that my life had just become infinitely richer. I'll be waiting for you on the other side whenever you arrive. But don't hurry, son. Live first. Live well. Live fully. All my love forever and always. Your mother, Margaret Rose. Cole. Nathaniel didn't realize he was crying until the tears dropped onto the paper. and he jerked the letter away to keep from damaging it. He set it carefully on the table and put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She'd known. Somehow, his mother had known exactly what he needed to hear. Not recriminations or guilt, but love, understanding, permission to forgive himself and move forward. And she'd tried, even from beyond the grave, to give him a reason to stay. Clara Bennett. Nathaniel wiped his face and read the letter again, more slowly this time, hearing his mother's voice in every word. When he finished, he folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket, over his heart. It was full dark outside now, the house lit only by the single lamp on the kitchen table. He should go to bed. He was exhausted, but he knew he wouldn't sleep. Too much was churning in his head. Too many emotions, too many questions, too many choices he didn't know how to make. Instead, he went out onto the porch and sat in his mother's rocking chair, looking out at the darkness where the mountains rose invisible against the stars. The wind had died down, and the night was clear and cold, the kind of cold that made you feel alive. Somewhere out there was the cemetery where his mother lay beside his father and brother. He needed to go there tomorrow. He needed to see her grave, say the goodbye he hadn't gotten to say in life. And somewhere out there was Clara Bennett, the woman his mother had called a gift from God, the woman who'd cared for a dying stranger with no expectation of reward. She's the kind of woman who makes a place feel like home. Nathaniel rocked slowly in the chair, the wood creaking beneath him in the same rhythm he remembered from childhood. His mother had rocked him in this chair when he was a baby. She'd sat here every evening of his youth, watching him play, watching him grow. She'd sat here alone after he left, waiting for a son who didn't come home. But he was home now. Too late for her to see it, but home nonetheless. The question was, what did he do next? He'd come back for a funeral, for duty, for guilt. He'd expected to settle the estate, sell the property, and move on. That had been the plan, such as it was. But now, sitting in his mother's chair, reading her words, feeling the weight of this place settle over him like a familiar blanket, he wasn't so sure. Give Copper Hollow a real chance, she'd written. Get to know the people again. Could he do that? Could he stay in a place that held so many painful memories? Could he face the people who'd known him as a boy, who'd watched him fight with his father, who'd seen him ride away in anger and shame? Could he face his own past long enough to build a future? Nathaniel didn't have the answers. Not tonight. Maybe not for many nights to come. But as he sat there in the darkness, with his mother's letter over his heart and the wind whispering through the pines, he felt something he hadn't felt in 8 long years. He felt like he might be exactly where he needed to be. Even if it was the last place he'd expected to end up. Even if it terrified him more than anything he'd faced on the frontier. He was home. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Nathaniel had dozed in the chair on the porch, waking every hour or so when the cold seeped through his coat, then drifting off again because going inside to the empty house felt worse than staying out here with the stars and the silence. When the sky finally started to lighten in the east, turning from black to deep blue to pale gray, he gave up on sleep entirely and went inside to make coffee. The kitchen felt different in the dawn light, less like a tomb and more like a room that had simply been waiting. He found his mother's coffee tin, still half full, and made a pot the way she'd taught him when he was 12 years old. Strong enough to stand a spoon in, she used to say. The familiar ritual steadied him, gave his hands something to do while his mind kept circling back to the letter in his pocket and the day ahead. He needed to go to the cemetery. That was first. Everything else could wait. After the coffee and some of the bread Clara had brought, he still had no real appetite, but his body needed fuel. Nathaniel washed up at the pump and changed into cleaner clothes from his saddlebag. His reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed a man who looked older than 31, with lines around his eyes from squinting into too many suns and a hardness in his jaw that hadn't been there 8 years ago. His dark hair needed cutting, and the beard he'd grown on the trail made him look rough, almost dangerous. He thought about shaving, then decided against it. Whoever he was now, this was the man who'd come home. No point in pretending otherwise. Blue was waiting in the barn, and Nathaniel saddled him quickly, his movements automatic from years of practice. The morning was cold and clear, frost still white on the grass in the shadows, and their breath made clouds in the air as they headed down the drive toward town. The cemetery sat on a gentle rise just east of the church, surrounded by a low stone wall that his grandfather had helped build back in the territorial days. White wooden crosses and gray headstones marked the graves of 3 generations of Copper Hollow residents, miners and ranchers, shopkeepers and wives, children who'd died too young, and old-timers who'd lived to see the new century. Nathaniel had been here last for Samuel's funeral, 20 years ago, when he'd been 11 years old and still believed that good people didn't die. He tied Blue to the fence and walked through the gate, his boots loud on the gravel path. He knew where the Cole plot was, southwest corner, under a massive cottonwood that turned gold in autumn. His grandparents were there. Samuel. And now his parents. The graves were easy to find. Someone had been tending them. The grass was trimmed, the stones were clean, and there were fresh flowers on his mother's grave despite the late season. Nathaniel stood at the foot of the 3 newest graves, reading the simple inscriptions. James Michael Cole, 1845 to 1922. Beloved husband and father. Samuel Robert Cole, 1874 to 1886. Gone too soon, forever in our hearts. Margaret Rose Cole, 1848 to 1925. She loved well and was well loved. That last line broke something in him. She'd loved well. She had. She'd loved her difficult husband and her lost son and her wayward boy who'd run away and left her alone. She'd loved well right up until the end. "I'm sorry, Mama," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice rough in the morning stillness. "I'm so sorry I didn't come sooner. I'm sorry for a lot of things." The wind rustled through the cottonwood branches, sending a few late leaves spinning down around him. He took off his hat and held it against his chest, the way he'd been taught to do in the presence of the dead. "I got your letter. Thank you for that. Thank you for understanding, even when I didn't deserve it." He paused, struggling for words. "I don't know if I can stay here, Mama. I don't know if I belong anymore. But I promise I'll try. I'll give it a real chance like you asked. I owe you that much." He stood there for a long time, just breathing, just being present in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in years. The sun climbed higher, burning off the frost, warming the air. Birds started singing in the trees, life going on, the way it always did, indifferent to human grief. Finally, Nathaniel moved to his father's grave and stood looking down at the stone. This was harder. The anger had faded over the years into something more complicated. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of weary acceptance. James Cole had been a hard man, quick to criticize and slow to praise. A man who'd expected perfection from himself and everyone around him. Nathaniel had never been able to meet that standard, no matter how hard he tried. The fight that had driven him away had been about something stupid. He couldn't even remember what now. A horse that needed shoeing, maybe, or fence that needed mending. Some small thing that had escalated into shouting, into words that cut like knives. His father saying he was lazy, worthless, that he'd never amount to anything. Nathaniel saying he was done trying to please a man who couldn't be pleased. Done living in the shadow of a dead brother who'd been perfect because he died before he could disappoint anyone. Cruel words, born of mutual stubbornness and too much pride. And then Nathaniel had saddled his horse and ridden away, and he'd never seen his father alive again. "She said you regretted it," Nathaniel told the headstone. "The things you said. She said you loved me, even if you couldn't show it." He was quiet for a moment. "I regret it too, Pa. I wish a lot of things. I wish I'd been a better son. I wish you'd been an easier father. I wish we'd had more time to figure out how to talk to each other like men instead of enemies." He crouched down and touched the stone, his fingers tracing the carved letters of his father's name. "I'm trying to forgive you. I'm trying to forgive myself. It's harder than I thought it'd be." There was no answer, of course, just the wind and the birds and the sun on his back. But somehow, saying the words out loud helped, made them real in a way thinking them never could. Nathaniel stood up and moved to Samuel's grave, the smallest of the 3. His little brother had been dead 20 years now, longer than he'd been alive. But Nathaniel still remembered him clearly. Gap-toothed grin, wild dark hair that never stayed combed, hands always dirty from digging in the creek or climbing trees. Samuel had hero-worshipped his older brother, following him everywhere, begging to help with the chores, sleeping in Nathaniel's room even though he had his own. Then the fever came, sweeping through the county that terrible summer, and Samuel was gone in 4 days. Nathaniel had been 11, Samuel 9. It had been the first time Nathaniel understood that the world wasn't fair, that bad things happened to good people, that love couldn't protect you from loss. "Hey, little brother," he said softly, "I miss you. Always have. I think about you sometimes and wonder what kind of man you'd have grown into. Better than me, probably. You were always the good one." He laid his hand on the stone for a moment, then straightened and put his hat back on. 3 graves. 3 people he'd loved and lost. 3 pieces of his heart buried in this red Arizona earth. But he was still here, still alive, and his mother's letter had made it clear that he had a choice about what came next. Nathaniel walked back through the cemetery, reading other names as he went. Some he recognized, old neighbors, school friends' parents, people who'd been part of the fabric of his childhood. Others were new, people who'd died in the years he'd been gone. The town had changed in his absence, even as it had stayed the same. He was untying Blue when he heard footsteps on the gravel path behind him. "I thought I might find you here." He turned to see Clara Bennett walking toward him, wearing a simple brown dress and carrying a basket over one arm. Her hair was pinned up neatly, and in the morning light he could see that she had freckles across her nose, faint as gold dust. She looked tired, like maybe she hadn't slept well either. "Miss Bennett," he said, surprised. "Good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Cole." She came to stand beside him at the fence, looking out at the cemetery. "I come most mornings to put flowers on the graves. Your mother's especially. I promised her I would." That explained the fresh flowers he'd seen. Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. "That's kind of you." "It's nothing." Clara opened the basket and took out several small bunches of dried wildflowers, carefully tied with string. "These won't last much longer. Winter's coming, but they're better than nothing. Would you like to come with me?" It wasn't really a question, and Nathaniel found himself falling into step beside her as she walked back through the gate. They moved through the cemetery in comfortable silence, Clara stopping at various graves to replace old flowers with new ones. She worked efficiently, her movements practiced, and Nathaniel noticed that she stopped at graves that didn't look like they had regular visitors, the forgotten ones, the lonely ones. "You do this often?" he asked as she knelt beside an old headstone so weathered he couldn't read the name. "Every few days when I have flowers." She brushed some leaves away from the base of the stone. "A lot of these people don't have family left to tend them. Seems wrong to let them be forgotten." "That's more than kind. That's saintly." Clara laughed, a soft sound like water over stones. "Hardly. I'm no saint, Mr. Cole. I just don't like seeing things neglected." She stood up and moved to the next grave. "Besides, your mother taught me that. She used to come here every week to tend Samuel's grave, but she never left without checking on the others, too. She said everyone deserves to be remembered." Of course she did. That sounded exactly like something Margaret Cole would say. They made their way to his family's plot, and Clara knelt beside his mother's grave, gently removing the flowers she'd placed earlier and replacing them with fresh ones. Her hands were careful, reverent, and Nathaniel watched her work with something like awe. This woman who'd never known him, who owed him nothing, was tending his mother's grave like it was her own family's. "Why?" The word came out before he could stop it. "Why did you do all this for her? For someone you didn't grow up knowing?" Clara sat back on her heels and looked up at him, her gray-green eyes thoughtful. "Because she needed help, and I could give it. Is there supposed to be another reason? Most people want something in return. I'm not most people." She said it matter-of-factly, without pride or defensiveness. Just a simple statement of truth. "Besides, your mother gave me plenty in return. Company, conversation, someone to care about. After my father died, I was alone in that house, alone with my thoughts, and that's not always a healthy place to be. Coming out here twice a week gave me purpose." She turned back to the flowers, adjusting them until they sat just right. "Your mother was easy to care for, Mr. Cole. She was kind and funny and wise. She told me stories about growing up in Missouri, about meeting your father, about you boys. She showed me how to make her biscuit recipe and taught me to play chess even though I was terrible at it. She never complained, even when I know she was hurting. She was just good company." Clara's voice had gone soft, almost wistful, and Nathaniel heard the grief in it. She'd lost someone she cared about too. "I should have been here," he said quietly. "It should have been me taking care of her, not a stranger." "I wasn't a stranger, not at the end." Clara stood up and brushed off her skirt. "And you're here now. That counts for something." "Does it? She's already gone." "But you're not." Clara looked at him directly, and there was something fierce in her expression now, something that made him think she'd be a formidable woman to have on your side in a fight. "You're here, and you have a choice about what you do next. You can let guilt eat you alive, or you can honor her memory by living the kind of life she wanted you to live. She talked about you all the time, Mr. Cole. She never stopped hoping you'd come home and find peace." "I don't know if I can. Find peace here, I mean." The admission cost him something, but Clara's directness seemed to invite honesty. "This place? It's full of ghosts. Everywhere is full of ghosts if you're carrying them around inside you." Clara picked up her basket. "Maybe it's time to let them rest." Before Nathaniel could figure out how to respond to that, she was already walking toward the gate. He followed, leading Blue, and caught up with her on the path back toward town. "Can I give you a ride?" he asked, gesturing to the horse. "It's the least I can do after all you've done." Clara glanced at him, then at Blue, and something that might have been amusement crossed her face. "That would be improper, Mr. Cole. A single woman riding with a single man? People would talk." "Let them." The word surprised him. When had he stopped caring what people thought? "You've walked enough for one morning." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but just to the edge of town. I have my reputation to consider, even if you don't care about yours." Nathaniel swung into the saddle, then reached down to help her up. Clara took his hand. Her grip was firm and calloused, the hand of someone who worked, and settled herself behind him, perched sideways in a way that looked desperately uncomfortable but was apparently the only acceptable option for a respectable woman. "Hold on," he said, and felt her hand rest lightly on his shoulder as he urged Blue forward. They rode in silence for a while, and Nathaniel was acutely aware of her presence behind him, the light weight of her, the faint scent of lavender soap, the way she adjusted her balance as the horse moved. It had been a long time since he'd been this close to a woman, and longer still since he'd been close to one who mattered. Clara Bennett mattered. He didn't know why yet, but he felt it. "You said you were the doctor's daughter," he said after a while, partly to break the silence and partly because he genuinely wanted to know. "Did you learn medicine from him?" "Some. I helped in his practice from the time I was 12. He taught me to set bones, stitch wounds, make poultices, deliver babies, the practical things." There was pride in her voice. "When he died, I thought about going to medical school. There are schools now that accept women, but I didn't have the money, so I just kept doing what I could. Dr. Pritchard lets me help when he needs it." "Lets you?" Clara's hand tightened slightly on his shoulder. "Dr. Pritchard is a good physician, but not a progressive thinker. He believes women should be nurses, not doctors. So officially, I'm just the helpful neighbor who sometimes assists. Unofficially, I do half his work." The bitterness in her voice was quiet but unmistakable. Nathaniel turned his head slightly, not enough to see her, but enough to show he was listening. "That doesn't seem fair." "It's not, but it's the way things are." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought about leaving, going somewhere bigger where I might have more opportunities. San Francisco, maybe, or Denver. But Copper Hollow is home, and these people, they need someone who cares. Dr. Pritchard is competent, but he's not compassionate. He treats illnesses, not people. Someone has to fill that gap. So you stay even though it costs you. We all make sacrifices, Mr. Cole. You of all people should understand that." He wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an indictment, but before he could ask, they'd reached the edge of town. Clara slipped down from the horse with practiced ease. Clearly, she'd ridden before, improper or not, and smoothed her skirts. "Thank you for the ride," she said, looking up at him with those clear eyes. "And Mr. Cole, if you need anything, help with the house, someone to talk to, whatever, you can find me at the White House on Maple Street, the one with the blue shutters. I'll remember that." He paused, then added, "And you can call me Nathaniel. Mr. Cole was my father." Something soft crossed her face. "Nathaniel, then. And you should call me Clara. Miss Bennett makes me feel like a spinster schoolmarm." Are you a spinster schoolmarm? Just the spinster part. But she said it with a slight smile that suggested the word didn't sting as much as it might have. I teach Sunday school sometimes, but that's as close as I get to being a schoolmarm. She raised a hand in farewell and walked away, her back straight, her steps confident. Nathaniel watched her go until she turned the corner onto Main Street and disappeared from view. Then he sat there on his horse in the middle of the road like a fool, trying to figure out what had just happened. He'd come to Copper Hollow expecting to settle his mother's estate and leave. Now, less than 24 hours after arriving, he was having conversations with a woman who made him want to stay, want to become the kind of man who deserved someone like her. His mother had been right. Clara Bennett was special. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Nathaniel spent the rest of the morning in town, taking care of practical matters he'd been putting off. First stop was the bank, where Mr. Henderson, older and grayer than Nathaniel remembered, but still sharp-eyed and precise, walked him through his mother's accounts and the deed to the property. Everything was in order, as his mother's letter had promised. The ranch was his, clear and free, along with a small savings account that wouldn't last long but would keep him going through the winter if he was careful. Your mother was a good woman, Henderson said as they finished the paperwork. Prudent with money, never asked for credit she couldn't repay. The town will miss her. Thank you, Nathaniel said, because what else could he say? Next was the general store where he bought basic supplies, coffee, flour, beans, ammunition for the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Mrs. Cassidy, who ran the store with her husband, clearly recognized him but didn't say anything beyond polite pleasantries. Word would spread now that he was back, but the story would stay neutral as long as he minded his manners. Small-town politics, he remembered, ran on respect and discretion. He was loading his purchases into blue saddlebags when a voice called out behind him. Nathaniel Cole? Is that really you? He turned to see a man about his age, stocky and ginger-haired, grinning at him like they'd just seen each other yesterday instead of 8 years ago. It took Nathaniel a moment to place him, then the memory clicked. Tommy Morrison? The one and only. Tommy strode over and clasped Nathaniel's hand, shaking it vigorously. Lord Almighty, Nate, I heard you were back, but I didn't believe it. 8 years. Where the hell have you been? Around, Nathaniel said, unable to help smiling. Tommy had been his best friend growing up, a wild kid who was always up for adventure and never met a rule he didn't want to break. Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, here and there. Here and there? Tommy repeated, shaking his head. That's the most Nathaniel Cole answer I've ever heard. Mysterious as always. Come on, let me buy you a drink. We've got years to catch up on. Nathaniel hesitated. He wasn't much for drinking these days. He'd seen too many men lose themselves in bottles. But Tommy's enthusiasm was infectious. And the truth was, it felt good to see a familiar face that was actually happy to see him. One drink, he agreed. Then I need to get back to the ranch. One drink, he says. Tommy clapped him on the shoulder. We'll see about that. The saloon, O'Brien's, same as it had always been, was quiet in the early afternoon, just a few old-timers nursing beers and playing cards. Tommy ordered 2 whiskeys and led Nathaniel to a table by the window where they could talk without being overheard. So, Tommy said after they'd both taken a drink, decent whiskey, better than Nathaniel had expected. The prodigal son returns. How's it feel to be home? Strange, Nathaniel admitted. Everything's the same but different, you know? I know exactly what you mean. Town hasn't changed much on the surface, but underneath, Tommy shrugged. People have come and gone. Your ma passing, that hit folks hard. She was well loved. I'm learning that. Met Clara Bennett yet? Tommy asked, and there was something knowing in his tone that made Nathaniel's guard go up. I have. Why? Just asking. She's the one who was taking care of your ma, right? Good woman. Shame about her husband. Nathaniel remembered his mother mentioning that. Clara had lost her husband 6 months after they married. What happened? Accident at the mine? Cave-in killed 3 men, Jacob Bennett among them. He and Clara had only been married since April, dead by October. Hell of a thing. Tommy took another drink. She handled it with grace, though. Never complained, never fell apart publicly, just kept going. That's Clara for you, steady as a rock. Sounds like you know her well. Everyone knows everyone here, Nate. You remember how it is? Tommy grinned. But if you're asking if I've got designs on her, the answer's no. I'm courting Sarah Mitchell, have been for 6 months now, planning to propose at Christmas. Congratulations, Nathaniel said, and meant it. They talked for an hour, catching up on the last 8 years in the compressed way old friends could. Tommy had taken over his father's ranch and was doing well, expanding the herd, making improvements. He'd grown up, essentially, while Nathaniel had been drifting. What about you? Tommy asked eventually. You planning to stick around this time, or is this just a quick visit to settle things? It was the question Nathaniel had been asking himself since he arrived. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Part of me wants to sell everything and move on. But another part wants to stay, Tommy finished. I get it. This place gets in your blood, Nate. You can run from it, but you can't shake it. Trust me, I thought about leaving 100 times. Never could do it. You never had a reason to leave. And you did. You're old man, I know. Tommy's expression sobered. I remember that fight, Nate. The whole town heard about it. James Cole wasn't an easy man. No, he wasn't. But he's gone now. Question is, can you make peace with his ghost? Nathaniel thought about his mother's letter, about standing at his father's grave this morning. I'm trying. That's all anyone can do. Tommy finished his whiskey and stood up. Look, I've got to get back to the ranch. Got 100 things to do before dark. But Nate, it's good to have you home. Real good. Don't be a stranger, all right? Come by the ranch sometime. Sarah would love to meet you, and we can ride like we used to. I'd like that, Nathaniel said, surprised to realize he meant it. After Tommy left, Nathaniel sat alone for a few minutes, nursing his whiskey and thinking. Tommy had grown up, put down roots, found someone to love. He'd built a life here, a good life, the kind of life that mattered. Could Nathaniel do the same? The saloon door opened and Reverend Thomas walked in, not to drink, but clearly looking for someone. When he spotted Nathaniel, his weathered face broke into a smile. Nathaniel Cole, I'd hoped to find you in town today. Nathaniel stood and shook the Reverend's hand. Thomas was in his 60s now, his dark hair gone white, but his grip was still strong and his eyes were still kind. He'd been a fixture in Copper Hollow for as long as Nathaniel could remember. Reverend, thank you for the telegram. I'm only sorry it had to be sent under such circumstances. Thomas gestured to the table. May I? They sat, and the Reverend studied Nathaniel with the particular intensity of a man who'd spent decades reading souls. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world, son. Just trying to figure out what comes next. Your mother hoped you'd stay. I hope you know that. She told me, in a letter she left. Nathaniel pulled it from his pocket and held it up briefly before putting it back. She asked me to give this place a chance. And will you? I don't know if I can, Reverend. There's too much history here, too much that went wrong. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, You know what I've learned in 40 years of ministry? The past only has as much power as we give it. Yes, bad things happened here. You and your father fought. You left. He died before you could reconcile. Those are facts, and they're painful, but they don't have to define your future. Don't they? I'm still the son who abandoned his mother, still the man who let pride and anger drive him away from everything that mattered. No, Thomas said firmly. You were that boy, but you're not anymore. You're a man now, Nathaniel, a man who's lived and worked and suffered and survived, a man who came back when it mattered, even if he was too late for one goodbye. That man has choices the boy didn't have. That man can decide who he wants to be. The words landed hard, stirring something in Nathaniel's chest. My mother said something similar, about forgiveness. She was a wise woman. I suggest you listen to her. The Reverend stood up. I'll be seeing you at church Sunday, I hope. It wasn't really a question, and Nathaniel found himself nodding before he'd thought it through. I'll be there. Good. Your mother's seat is still empty. It would do my heart good to see it filled. After the Reverend left, Nathaniel paid for his drink and walked back out into the afternoon sunlight. The town was busier now, people going about their errands, children playing in the street. He recognized some faces, got a few nods of acknowledgement, felt the weight of curious stares. Let them look, let them wonder. He had nothing to hide. He was untying Blue when a woman's voice called out, Mr. Cole! He turned to see Clara hurrying toward him, slightly out of breath. her bonnet askew. She'd changed into a different dress, dark green this time, and carried a doctor's bag. "I was hoping I'd catch you," she said. "Do you know anything about delivering babies?" Nathaniel blinked. "What?" "Babies. Have you ever helped deliver one?" "I've helped with calves and foals, but close enough. I need your help." She was already walking toward a wagon tied nearby, clearly expecting him to follow. "Mrs. Garcia is in labor, her fourth child, and it's coming fast. Dr. Pritchard is 20 miles away tending to a man who got kicked by a horse. I can handle most of it, but she's a big woman and I might need help moving her. Please?" There was such urgency in her voice, such absolute confidence that he would help, that Nathaniel found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the request. "All right, lead the way." Clara's relief was visible. "Thank you, truly. Come on, we need to hurry." They rode in her wagon, faster than being on horseback with all her supplies, out to a small homestead about a mile from town. Nathaniel could hear the woman screaming before they even pulled up to the house, a sound of pain and effort that made his stomach clench. Inside was chaos. Mrs. Garcia, a sturdy woman in her 30s with black hair plastered to her face with sweat, was on the bed, gripping the headboard and making sounds that didn't seem like they should come from a human throat. Her 3 children, all under 8, were huddled in the corner, looking terrified. Her husband, a thin man with wild eyes, was pacing and wringing his hands. Clara took control immediately. "Mr. Garcia, take the children outside. All of them. Now." Her voice was calm but left no room for argument. "Nathaniel, Mr. Cole, I need you to help me get her positioned." For the next 2 hours, Nathaniel did whatever Clara told him to do. He held Mrs. Garcia's hand when she needed something to squeeze. He helped move her when Clara needed better access. He fetched water, brought towels, and tried not to pass out when things got bloody and intense. Through it all, Clara worked with absolute focus, her hand steady, her voice calm, talking Mrs. Garcia through each contraction, each push, guiding the baby into the world with a competence that was stunning to watch. When the baby finally emerged, a girl, red-faced and screaming, Clara moved with practiced efficiency, clearing the infant's airways, cutting the cord, cleaning her up and wrapping her in a soft blanket before placing her on her mother's chest. "A daughter," Clara said softly, her face glowing with something that looked like joy. "Perfect and healthy. Well done, Maria. Well done." Mrs. Garcia was crying and laughing and cooing to her new daughter all at once, and Nathaniel felt something crack open in his chest. Life. New life, coming into this world despite all the pain and blood and terror. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he'd ever witnessed. Clara was checking on the mother, making sure everything was as it should be, giving quiet instructions about care and feeding. Nathaniel stepped back, giving them space, and found himself outside on the porch where Mr. Garcia was entertaining his other children with stories to keep them calm. When Clara finally emerged an hour later, she looked exhausted but satisfied. "Mother and baby are both doing well," she told Garcia. "But Maria needs rest, lots of it, and someone to help with the other children for a few days. Can you manage that?" Yes, of course. My sister will come." Garcia grabbed Clara's hands, tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Miss Clara. Thank you so much. You are an angel." "I'm not an angel, just a woman who knows a little medicine." But she smiled, clearly pleased. "I'll check on her tomorrow, keep the baby warm, and make sure Maria drinks plenty of water." They rode back to town in silence, both too tired for conversation. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and Nathaniel felt wrung out in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Thank you for your help," Clara said finally as they reached town. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You could have," Nathaniel said honestly. "You were amazing in there, Clara. You knew exactly what to do." She ducked her head, almost shy. "I've delivered 23 babies now. You'd think I'd be used to it, but every time still feels like a miracle." "It is a miracle." Nathaniel looked at her, this woman who brought life into the world and tended the dying with equal care, who was too capable and too generous for her own good. "You should be a doctor, a real one with credentials and respect, not just Dr. Pritchard's assistant." Clara's smile was sad. Should be doesn't mean can be, Nathaniel. Not for women like me in towns like this. But I do what I can, and that has to be enough. It's more than enough. It's everything. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or possibility. Then the moment broke and she was gathering the reins, preparing to drive herself home. "I'll see you Sunday?" she asked. "At church?" "You will." "Good," she smiled. "Welcome home, Nathaniel Cole. I think Copper Hollow is better for having you back." Then she drove away, leaving Nathaniel standing in the street with the sunset burning behind her and something warm and hopeful beginning to bloom in his chest. Maybe his mother had been right. Maybe he could find a reason to stay. Maybe that reason was already here, wearing a green dress and bringing new life into the world with capable hands and a compassionate heart. Maybe Clara Bennett was exactly what he'd been searching for all along, without knowing he was searching for anything at all. Sunday came with a sky so blue it hurt to look at, the kind of perfect autumn morning that made you believe in grace. Nathaniel stood in front of the small mirror in his bedroom, trying to knot his tie with hands that had forgotten how. It had been years since he'd worn anything but work clothes, and the suit he'd found in his old trunk, black wool, slightly moth-eaten, but serviceable, felt strange against his skin, like he was wearing someone else's life. He'd spent the last 2 days working on the ranch, throwing himself into physical labor to quiet the noise in his head, fixing fence, mucking stalls, clearing brush, doing all the things his mother hadn't been able to do in her last years. The work felt good, made him remember why he'd loved this place once, before everything went wrong, made him wonder if maybe he could love it again. But now, staring at his reflection, clean-shaven, finally, hair trimmed with kitchen scissors that left it uneven but decent, he felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with clothing. Going to church meant facing the whole town, meant being seen and judged and measured against the boy who'd left, meant sitting in his mother's pew and feeling her absence like a wound. It also meant seeing Clara again, and that thought steadied him more than anything else. Clara, who'd looked at him with those clear eyes and seen something worth helping. Clara, who'd welcomed him home without reservation or judgment. Clara, who'd brought a baby into the world with such confidence and care that he still thought about it every time he closed his eyes. He gave up on the tie, it would have to be crooked, and headed out to Saddle Blue. The ride into town was quiet, just him and the horse and the morning sounds of birds and wind. Other riders and wagons appeared on the road as he got closer, all heading the same direction. Families in their Sunday best, children scrubbed clean and squirming in their seats, everyone moving toward the white church with its tall steeple like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Nathaniel tied Blue to the hitching post with a dozen other horses and stood there for a moment, gathering his nerve. Through the open church doors he could hear voices, the rustle of movement, the opening chords of the piano. Mrs. Fletcher, he remembered. She'd been playing for services since before he was born. "You coming in or planning to stand out here all morning?" He turned to find Tommy Morrison grinning at him, looking uncomfortable in a tight collar and with a pretty blonde woman on his arm who had to be Sarah Mitchell. She had kind eyes and a warm smile, and when Tommy introduced them, she shook Nathaniel's hand firmly. "Tommy's told me so much about you," she said. "I'm glad you're back. Margaret spoke of you often." The use of his mother's first name surprised him. It suggested real friendship, not just acquaintance. "You knew her?" "I helped with her garden sometimes, the last year or so. She loved her roses." Sarah's expression softened. "She was proud of you, Nathaniel, even when you were far away, especially then." The words lodged in his throat, too big to swallow. He managed a nod, and Sarah had the grace to let the moment pass without pushing. "Come on," Tommy said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Let's get seats before the place fills up. You can sit with us if you want." But Nathaniel shook his head. "Thank you, but I should sit in the family pew. It's what she'd want." The interior of the church was exactly as he remembered. Whitewashed walls, simple wooden pews, windows that let in the morning light in golden shafts. The cross at the front was plain pine, nothing fancy, and the altar was covered with a white cloth his grandmother had embroidered 50 years ago. Everything was worn and loved and familiar in a way that made his chest ache. People were already seated, and heads turned as he walked down the aisle. He felt their eyes on him, heard the whispers start. There's the Cole boy, back after all these years, heard his mother died, wonder if he'll stay. But he kept his gaze forward and his shoulders straight. The Cole family pew was 3 rows from the front on the left side, and it was empty except for dust motes dancing in the sunlight. Nathaniel slid into the seat and sat down, his hands folded in his lap. The wood was smooth from generations of Coles sitting here, worshiping here, being part of this community. His great-grandparents, his grandparents, his parents, Samuel, him, and now just him. Is this seat taken? He looked up to find Clara standing in the aisle, wearing a dove-gray dress with a white collar and her hair pinned up under a small hat. She looked proper and respectable and absolutely beautiful, and Nathaniel's heart did something complicated in his chest. No, he managed. Please. She settled beside him with a rustle of skirts, and suddenly the pew didn't feel so empty anymore. Other people were still filing in, the church filling up with the good people of Copper Hollow, but Nathaniel was acutely aware only of Clara beside him, the faint scent of lavender, the warmth of her presence, the way her hands rested calmly in her lap. "How's Mrs. Garcia?" he asked quietly. "Doing wonderfully. The baby's nursing well and Maria's recovering beautifully." Clara smiled. "They named her Grace. Little Grace Maria Garcia." "That's a good name." "It is." Clara glanced at him. "How are you doing, really?" The question was genuine, not just polite conversation, and Nathaniel found himself answering honestly. "I don't know yet. Some moments I think I can do this, stay here, make a life. Other moments I feel like I'm suffocating. That's normal. Grief isn't linear." She said it like she knew from experience, and he remembered she'd lost her husband and father both. "Give yourself time, Nathaniel. You've only been back 3 days." Before he could respond, Reverend Thomas appeared at the front, and the congregation settled into silence. The service began with a hymn, Amazing Grace, which felt both fitting and painful, and Nathaniel stood with everyone else, holding the hymnal Clara shared with him, their voices blending with 100 others. The Reverend's sermon was about homecoming, about the prodigal son returning, and Nathaniel knew it was meant for him even though Thomas never said his name. The message was simple. It's never too late to come home, never too late to be welcomed back into the fold, never too late to start again. God's grace was infinite, and so should man's be. Nathaniel wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that the people around him, his neighbors, his community, could accept him back without resentment or judgment. Wanted to believe he could accept himself. When the service ended and people began filing out, several stopped to speak to him. Mrs. Morrison, Tommy's mother, hugged him tight and told him she'd been praying for him. Old Mr. Henderson from the bank shook his hand and said his mother had been a pillar of the community. The schoolteacher, Miss Warren, knew since he'd left, introduced herself and said she'd heard good things about the Cole family. And through it all, Clara stayed close, a steady presence at his elbow, deflecting the more invasive questions with practiced grace and steering him through conversations like a ship through rough water. She seemed to know instinctively when he was getting overwhelmed, when he needed an out, when he could handle one more well-meaning inquiry. By the time they made it outside into the sunshine, Nathaniel felt wrung out but lighter somehow. He'd survived. The town hadn't rejected him. People seemed genuinely glad he was back. "You did well," Clara said as they stood on the church steps, watching families load into wagons and head home for Sunday dinner. "I felt like an exhibit at a fair." She laughed, that soft sound he was coming to treasure. "That's small-town life. Everyone's interested in everyone else's business. You'll get used to it again." "Will I?" "If you stay, yes." She looked at him directly. "Are you? Staying?" It was the question everyone wanted to ask, but only Clara had the courage to voice. Nathaniel looked out at the town spread before them, the neat houses, the wide main street, the mountains rising beyond, and felt something shift inside him. "I'm thinking about it," he said slowly, more seriously than I expected to. Clara's smile was like sunrise. "Good. The town could use someone like you." "Someone like me? A drifter who abandoned his family?" "No." Her voice was firm. "A strong man who's learned hard lessons and come home ready to use them. That's what I see when I look at you, Nathaniel. Not the mistakes you've made, but the man you've become." Before he could figure out how to respond to that, how to explain that her faith in him was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. A commotion across the churchyard caught their attention. Wait, and his voice to calm it. Easy, boy. Easy now. Nothing's going to hurt you. Easy. It took 3 long minutes of steady pressure and calm words before the horse stopped fighting and stood trembling, its sides heaving. Nathaniel kept one hand on the bridle and used the other to stroke the animal's neck, murmuring nonsense until the panic faded from its eyes. "Someone want to tell me what happened?" he asked, not looking away from the horse. "Rattlesnake?" a man said. Nathaniel recognized him vaguely, one of the newer ranchers. Crossed right in front of him. Horse is green, not used to it. "I'm sorry. I should have had better control. Not your fault. Young horses spook easy." Nathaniel checked the horse over quickly, making sure it hadn't injured itself in the panic. "He's all right, just scared. You'll want to work with him on this kind of thing before you take him into town again." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. If you hadn't, someone would have." But Nathaniel accepted the man's gratitude with a nod and handed off the horse, his heart still hammering from the adrenaline. Clara appeared at his elbow, and her eyes were shining with something that looked like pride. That was impressive. That was stupid. Could have gotten kicked. But you didn't. You trusted your instincts and your skill, and you probably saved that man's wagon, maybe even his children. She tilted her head, studying him. "You're good with horses. Been around them all my life." He flexed his hand, which was already starting to bruise from the force of holding the bridle. "Though I'm out of practice with the dramatic rescues." "Well, you haven't lost your touch." Clara glanced around at the dispersing crowd, then back at him. "Do you have plans for dinner?" The question caught him off guard. "I was going to head back to the ranch, heat up some of that food you brought." "Would you like company?" His heart stuttered. "You want to come to the ranch? For dinner?" "If you'll have me." She said it simply, without coyness or calculation. "I thought you might like someone to talk to. And I'd like to see the place again. I spent a lot of time there with your mother. It would be nice to remember the good times." Nathaniel knew he should probably say no. Having Clara at the ranch, in his mother's kitchen, sitting at the family table, it felt intimate in a way that went beyond propriety. People would talk. They'd assume things. But the thought of going back to that empty house alone, of spending another Sunday in silence with only his thoughts for company, was suddenly unbearable. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." They rode out together in Clara's wagon, blue-tied behind, and the 11 o'clock sun was warm on their shoulders as they left town. Clara drove with easy competence, handling the reins like she'd been born to it, and they fell into comfortable conversation about small things, the weather, the harvest, the people they'd seen at church. But underneath the easy talk, Nathaniel felt something building, some awareness that this mattered more than it should. That inviting Clara to his home, sharing a meal with her, was a step towards something he wasn't sure he was ready for, but couldn't seem to stop himself from wanting. When they reached the ranch, Clara looked around with obvious pleasure. "It looks good, Nathaniel. You've been working hard." Needed to be done. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands at her waist, for just a moment longer than necessary. Place was falling apart. Inside, the house was tidier than it had been 3 days ago. Nathaniel had spent yesterday cleaning, unable to stand living in dust and neglect. Clara moved through the rooms with the familiarity of someone who'd been here often, trailing her fingers along furniture, pausing to look at pictures on the walls. "Your mother kept this one on her nightstand," she said, picking up a photograph of Nathaniel and Samuel as boys, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. She'd look at it every night before she went to sleep. The information hit him like a fist. "I didn't know that." "She missed you both. Samuel because he was gone forever, and you because you'd chosen to be gone." Clara set the picture down carefully. But she understood Nathaniel. She really did. She knew some people need to leave to figure out who they are. "Did I figure it out?" He hadn't meant to ask the question out loud, but Clara's presence seemed to pull honesty from him whether he wanted it or not. She turned to face him fully, her gray-green eyes serious. "That's not a question I can answer. Only you know who you are now, and whether that's who you want to be." They moved to the kitchen, and Clara took charge with the ease of someone comfortable in this space. Together they prepared a simple meal from the supplies she'd brought: cold ham, fresh bread, pickled vegetables, apple pie. Nathaniel set the table while Clara arranged everything, and when they finally sat down across from each other, it felt shockingly domestic, like something out of the life he'd never let himself imagine. "Tell me about your husband," Nathaniel said as they ate, then immediately regretted it. "I'm sorry, that's too personal. You don't have to—" "It's all right." Clara cut a piece of ham with careful precision. "Jacob was a good man, gentle, kind, hard-working. We grew up together. He was my father's apprentice, learning to be a physician. We'd been courting for 2 years when he proposed." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "The wedding was in April, right here in this church. Everything was perfect. We had plans. Jacob was going to take over my father's practice eventually. We'd have children, grow old together in Copper Hollow. All the normal dreams. What happened? The mine." Her voice was flat, carefully controlled. "There'd been problems with one of the shafts. Everyone knew it wasn't stable, but the company pushed the men to keep working anyway. Jacob wasn't even a miner. He'd gone down because one of the workers had injured his hand and they needed someone to stitch it up. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time when the ceiling came down." Nathaniel reached across the table without thinking and covered her hand with his. "I'm sorry, Clara. They didn't find his body for 3 days." Now her voice cracked slightly, the control slipping. "I spent those 3 days praying for a miracle, telling myself he was alive, trapped, but alive, waiting for rescue. When they finally brought him up," she drew a shaky breath, "there was no open casket." "Jesus." Nathaniel tightened his grip on her hand and she turned her palm up to lace her fingers through his. "My father died 6 months later. Heart attack, the doctor said, but I think it was grief. Jacob had been like a son to him. Losing him broke something inside my father." Clara looked down at their joined hands. "So within a year, I'd lost the 2 most important people in my world. I was 22 years old and completely alone." "But you stayed. You didn't leave." "Where would I go?" She met his eyes, and he saw the steel beneath her gentle exterior. "This is my home, Nathaniel. These are my people. I couldn't abandon them just because life got hard. So I stayed and I learned to live with the grief, and I found purpose in helping others. It's not the life I planned, but it's the life I have. And most days that's enough." They sat in silence for a moment, still holding hands across the table, connected by shared understanding of loss and loneliness and the hard work of continuing on. "Thank you for telling me," Nathaniel said finally, "for trusting me with that. Thank you for asking." Clara squeezed his hand once, then gently pulled away to take a sip of water. "Your turn. Tell me about the last 8 years, not the places you've been, the person you've become." So he did. Haltingly at first, then with growing ease, Nathaniel told her about the years of drifting. Working ranches in Wyoming where the winters nearly killed him. Cattle drives through Colorado where he learned to read men as well as he could read horses. The deputy job in New Mexico that had ended when he refused to help a corrupt sheriff run honest farmers off their land. The mining camps where he'd seen what desperation and greed could do to people. He told her about the fights he'd been in, the mistakes he'd made, the times he'd been so broke he'd gone hungry rather than ask for help. He told her about the loneliness of sleeping under different stars every night, always moving, never belonging anywhere. He told her about the morning he'd woken up in a flophouse in Butte and realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt truly happy. "That's when the telegram came," he finished. "Maybe 3 hours after I'd had that thought, like the universe was giving me one last chance to come home." Clara had listened without interrupting, her face reflecting every emotion, sympathy, understanding, sometimes a flash of what might have been anger on his behalf. Now she said, "Do you think you can be happy here? If you stayed?" "I don't know, but for the first time in 8 years, I think I might want to find out." He looked at her across the table. This woman who'd known his mother, who'd welcomed him without judgment, who'd let him see her grief and trusted him to handle it carefully. Especially if there were reasons to stay beyond just the land. Claire's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't look away. "What kind of reasons?" The kind that involves Sunday dinners and conversations that matter, and maybe... He stopped, suddenly aware he was moving too fast, saying too much. I'm sorry, that's presumptuous. You barely know me. I know you better than you think. Clara's voice was soft but certain. I know you came when your mother needed you, even though you were too late. I know you helped deliver a baby without hesitation. I know you calmed a spooked horse today when most men would have backed away. I know you've spent 2 days working yourself to exhaustion fixing up this ranch, instead of just selling it and leaving. That tells me plenty about who you are, Nathaniel Cole. And who am I? Someone worth knowing better. She smiled, and it transformed her whole face. Someone I'd like to know better, if you're willing. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Nathaniel felt like he was standing at a crossroads, like the next words out of his mouth would determine the entire path of his future. He could deflect, make a joke, keep things light and safe. Or he could be honest, take the risk, reach for what he wanted even though it terrified him. I'd like that too, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Very much. Clara's smile widened, and Nathaniel felt something warm and hopeful unfurl in his chest. It wasn't love, not yet, too soon for that, but it was the beginning of something that could become love if they were both brave enough to let it. They spent the rest of the afternoon together, and it felt remarkably easy. Clara helped him with chores around the ranch, proving she knew her way around horses and livestock as well as she knew medicine. They fed the chickens, a small flock Nathaniel had found half wild in the hills and coaxed back to the coop, and checked the fences and talked about everything and nothing. When the shadows started growing long, Clara said she should head back to town before people started gossiping too much about her spending the whole day at a bachelor's ranch. Let them gossip, Nathaniel said, surprising himself. Unless it bothers you? It doesn't bother me as much as it probably should. Clara gathered her things, smoothing her skirts. But I do have some reputation left to maintain, and I'd prefer not to burn through it all in one Sunday. He walked her out to the wagon and helped her up, his hands lingering at her waist again. Thank you for today. For the company and the conversation and just everything. Thank you for inviting me. She settled the reins in her hands. Nathaniel, there's a harvest dance next Saturday at the community hall. I was wondering if you might like to go. With me. His heart kicked hard against his ribs. A public dance, with Clara Bennett as his companion. The whole town would see them together, would draw conclusions, would start matchmaking or criticizing depending on their disposition. It would be a statement, a declaration that he was staying, that he was part of this community again, that he was interested in courting the town's most eligible widow. It should have scared him. Instead, it felt like exactly what he wanted. I'd be honored, he said. Though fair warning, I'm not much of a dancer. Neither am I. We'll stumble around together and scandalize the gossips. Clara's eyes sparkled with mischief. Pick me up at 6? I'll be there at 5:30. She laughed, that sound he was rapidly becoming addicted to, and drove away with a final wave. Nathaniel stood in the yard watching until she disappeared around the bend, then turned to look at his ranch, his home, with new eyes. The house didn't feel so empty anymore. The work ahead didn't seem so overwhelming. The future didn't look quite so uncertain. Maybe his mother had been right about everything. Maybe coming home wasn't about going backward, but about finally moving forward. Maybe Clara Bennett was exactly the reason he'd needed to stay, even though he hadn't known he was looking for a reason at all. The next week passed in a blur of work and anticipation. Nathaniel threw himself into the ranch with renewed energy, fixing everything that needed fixing and some things that didn't just because he could. He rode into town twice, once to order supplies from the mercantile, once to talk to Mr. Henderson about ranch finances and property taxes. Both times he found excuses to walk past Clara's house on Maple Street with the blue shutters, though he only knocked on the door once. She'd invited him in for coffee, and they'd sat in her small, tidy parlor and talked about medicine and horses and the upcoming dance. Her house was neat and feminine without being fussy, full of books and medical texts and dried herbs hanging from the rafters. It smelled like lavender and lemon and something else he couldn't identify. Comfort, maybe, or home. My father's clinic was in the back room, Claire explained when she caught him looking at a closed door. After he died, I thought about reopening it as my own practice, But Dr. Pritchard made it clear he wouldn't welcome the competition, so I just use it for storage now. That's his loss, Nathaniel said firmly. You're twice the healer he is from what I've seen. Clara had blushed and changed the subject, but he could tell his words pleased her. By Saturday, Nathaniel was as nervous as a schoolboy before his first dance. He bathed in the creek, too cold for comfort but needs must, and put on his best shirt, the one without patches or stains. He'd even bought a new string tie from the mercantile, dark blue silk that Mrs. Cassidy had assured him was very fashionable. He felt like a fool wearing it, but when he looked in the mirror, he had to admit he looked more respectable than he had in years. Blue seemed to sense the importance of the occasion and behaved beautifully on the ride into town. The sun was just beginning to set when Nathaniel tied him to the post outside Clara's house and walked up the path to her front door, his heart hammering so hard he was sure the whole street could hear it. He knocked, and after a moment Clara opened the door, and Nathaniel forgot how to breathe. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before, deep blue cotton that brought out the green in her gray-green eyes, with a fitted bodice and a full skirt that rustled when she moved. Her hair was pinned up in a soft style that left a few curls framing her face, and she wore small pearl earrings that must have been precious to her. She looked beautiful, elegant, like someone who belonged in a big city instead of a small Arizona town. "You're staring," Clara said, but she was smiling. "You're beautiful," Nathaniel managed. "I mean, you look beautiful. The dress, it's—" He gave up. "I'm terrible at this." "You're doing fine." She picked up a shawl from the coat rack. "Shall we go?" The walk to the community hall took 10 minutes, and Nathaniel was acutely conscious of Clara's hand resting lightly on his arm, of the way people they passed smiled and nodded, of the way this felt simultaneously terrifying and absolutely right. The hall was already full of people when they arrived, the space decorated with autumn leaves and bunting, lanterns hanging from the rafters casting everything in warm, golden light. A small band, fiddle, guitar, and someone's uncle on the harmonica, was tuning up in the corner. Tommy spotted them immediately and waved them over to where he stood with Sarah. "About time!" "We were starting to think you'd chickened out, Nate." "Not a chance." Nathaniel helped Clara with her shawl, intensely aware of his hands near her shoulders. "Though I did warn her I'm not much of a dancer." "Oh, we'll fix that," Sarah said cheerfully. "The first dance is always a group reel anyway. Just follow along and try not to step on too many toes." The evening unfolded in a whirl of music and movement. Nathaniel did step on toes, Clara's twice, his own once, but she just laughed and guided him through the steps with patient good humor. Between dances, they drank punch and talked with other couples, and Nathaniel slowly realized that people were accepting him back into the community. Not as the boy who'd left, but as the man who'd returned. Mrs. Morrison pulled him aside at one point and told him his mother would be proud of him. Mr. Garcia, the man whose wife Clara had helped deliver, shook his hand and said Copper Hollow needed men like him. Even crusty old Mr. Henderson cracked a smile and said it was good to see a Cole working the family ranch again. But the best moment came near the end of the evening when the band struck up a slow waltz and Nathaniel gathered his courage to lead Clara onto the floor. They moved together awkwardly at first. He really wasn't much of a dancer, but after a few stumbles they found a rhythm, and suddenly it felt easy and natural and right. "Thank you for this," Nathaniel said quietly, his hand warm at her waist. "For asking me. For giving me a reason to stay." Clara looked up at him, and in the lantern light her eyes were luminous. "Is that what I am? A reason to stay?" "One of them. Maybe the most important one." He took a breath. "Clara, I know it's fast. I know I just got back and you barely know me, and this probably seems crazy, but I need you to know that when I think about staying in Copper Hollow, when I think about building a life here, I see you in it, not just as a friend or a neighbor, but as more, as something that could become everything, if you'd let it." Clara's breath caught, and for a moment they just swayed together to the music, the rest of the world fading away until it was just the two of them in their own small circle of light. "I see it too," she whispered finally. "When I look at you, Nathaniel, I see possibility. I see second chances. I see someone brave enough to come home even when it's hard, strong enough to admit his mistakes, and kind enough to want to do better. I see someone I could care about very much if I let myself." "So let yourself." His voice was rough with emotion. Let yourself care. Let me care about you. Let's see where this goes. What if it goes nowhere? What if you decide you can't stay after all? I won't. And as he said it, Nathaniel realized it was true. He wasn't leaving. Not again. Not now that he'd found something. Someone worth staying for. I'm home, Clara. For good this time, and if you'll have me, I'd like to spend whatever time you're willing to give me proving that I'm worth the risk. Clara smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. Then I guess we're doing this. I guess we are. They finished the dance in silence, but it was the comfortable kind, full of understanding and promise. When the song ended, Nathaniel didn't let go of her hand, and Clara didn't pull away. They stood there on the edge of the dance floor, surrounded by their community, and Nathaniel felt something he hadn't felt in 8 long years. He felt like he belonged. Later, when he walked Clara home through the cool night air, they talked about small things and big things and everything in between. At her door, Nathaniel hesitated, not sure of the protocol, not wanting to presume. Thank you for tonight, Clara said softly, for the dance and the honesty and the promise of what might come next. Thank you for taking a chance on a drifter with too much past and not enough sense. She laughed and reached up to touch his cheek, just briefly, her hand soft against his rough skin. You're not a drifter anymore, Nathaniel Cole. You're home. Try to remember that. Then she slipped inside, leaving him standing on her porch with his heart full and his future suddenly bright with possibility. Nathaniel walked back to where Blue waited, untied the horse, and swung into the saddle. The ride back to the ranch was quiet and dark, but he wasn't lonely. Not anymore. He had a home. He had a community. And maybe, just maybe, he was falling in love with a woman who made him believe in second chances. His mother had been right about everything. Clara Bennett was the reason he'd needed to find. Now he just had to prove he was worthy of keeping her. The weeks that followed the harvest dance settled into a rhythm that felt like the beginning of something permanent. Nathaniel found himself riding into town 3 or 4 times a week, always with some practical excuse, supplies to pick up, business with the bank, fence posts to order, but everyone including him knew the real reason. Clara Bennett had become the center around which his days orbited, the thought that got him out of bed in the morning and kept him working long after the sun went down. They were courting, though neither of them had used that word explicitly. It was understood in the way he appeared at her door on Wednesday afternoons when she had time between patients, in the way she rode out to the ranch on Saturday mornings with fresh bread and stayed to help with whatever project he was working on, in the way they sat together at church now, not just side by side, but connected, her hand sometimes finding his during the hymns. The town watched with interest but approval. Clara was well loved, and Nathaniel was proving himself through hard work and steady presence. He'd helped Mr. Garcia repair his barn roof. He'd spent an afternoon teaching the Morrison boys to break a young horse without breaking its spirit. He'd donated half a beef to the church for families who were struggling through a hard winter. Small acts, but they added up to something larger. A man becoming part of his community again, putting down roots that went deep. It was early December when everything shifted from possibility to inevitability. Nathaniel was in town picking up a load of hay when he ran into Tommy Morrison outside the feed store, and his friend's face was grim. "You heard about the Pritchard situation?" Tommy asked without preamble. Nathaniel's stomach clenched. "What situation?" "Doc's been drinking. Has been for months, apparently, but it got bad this week. Mrs. Chen came to him yesterday with her boy who'd split his head open falling off a fence. Doc was so drunk he could barely stand, let alone stitch. Clara had to do it while he sat in the corner and slept it off." Jesus. Nathaniel felt anger rise hot in his chest. "Is the boy all right?" "He's fine. Clara's good at what she does." "But Nate, this isn't the first time. People are saying Doc's been drinking before surgery, showing up to house calls reeking of whiskey, making mistakes. Clara's been covering for him, doing the actual work while he takes the credit and the payment." Tommy's expression was troubled. "Something's got to give." Nathaniel found Clara at her house an hour later, sitting at her kitchen table with her head in her hands and her medical bag open beside her, instruments still bloody from whatever emergency she'd just handled. She looked exhausted, strung out, like she'd been carrying weight too heavy for too long. Clara. He crossed to her in 3 strides and knelt beside her chair. Tommy told me. About Pritchard. She looked up, and there were tears tracking down her face. I can't keep doing this, Nathaniel. I can't keep watching him endanger people while I scramble to fix his mistakes. Today, it was the Chen boy, but next time, what if it's something I can't fix? What if someone dies because I'm too busy protecting a drunk's reputation? Then stop protecting him. Nathaniel took her hands, cold and trembling in his. Stop covering. Let people see what he really is. And then what? There's no other doctor within 20 miles. If Pritchard loses his practice, this town has no medical care at all except what I can provide. And I'm not a real doctor. I don't have credentials or authority or... You have skill and compassion and more practical experience than most doctors with fancy degrees. Nathaniel's voice was fierce. Clara, you're the one people trust. You're the one they call for when they're really scared. Pritchard's just the name on the shingle. The name matters. But her voice was wavering, like she wanted to believe him but couldn't quite let herself. Without it, I'm just a woman playing at medicine. No. You're the woman who's been keeping this town healthy while Pritchard's been drinking himself into a stupor, and it's time people knew that. Over the next week, the situation came to a head in a way neither of them could have predicted. Mrs. Garcia went into early labor with complications, and someone ran to fetch Dr. Pritchard. He showed up drunk, fumbled his examination, and declared that both mother and baby would probably die, and there was nothing to be done. Then he left to go drink more, leaving Maria Garcia screaming in agony and her husband wild with terror. Clara arrived an hour later. Someone had the sense to fetch her when Pritchard proved useless, and worked through the night to save them both. It was touch and go, requiring every bit of skill and knowledge she possessed. But by dawn, Maria had delivered a healthy son, and both were stable. Clara had saved 2 lives that Dr. Pritchard had written off as lost causes. The town's response was swift and decisive. A group of prominent citizens, including Mr. Henderson, Reverend Thomas, and the mayor, called a meeting to discuss the situation. Nathaniel went with Clara for support, his hand steady at the small of her back as they walked into the community hall to face a room full of their neighbors. Henderson spoke first, his banker's voice calm and authoritative. We all know why we're here. Dr. Pritchard's drinking has become a danger to this community. He's lost the trust and confidence of the people he's meant to serve. The question is what we do about it. Send him away, someone called from the back. Get a new doctor. Well, finding a doctor willing to come to a small town like Copper Hollow will take months, maybe years, the mayor countered. In the meantime, we need medical care. We have medical care. Mrs. Morrison stood up, her voice ringing clear. We have Clara Bennett, who's been doing the real doctoring in this town for 2 years while Pritchard stumbled around drunk. My grandson was born breech. Clara turned him in the womb and saved both him and my daughter. The Chen boy's head wound. Clara stitched it with 17 perfect stitches while Pritchard snored in the corner. Maria Garcia and her baby. Clara saved them both when Pritchard said they'd die. How many more examples do we need? A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, and Nathaniel felt Clara's hand find his, gripping tight. Reverend Thomas stood next. The question isn't whether Clara is capable. We all know she is. The question is whether we're willing to accept a woman as our town's primary physician, without official credentials, without the blessing of the medical establishment. I don't care about credentials, Mr. Garcia said, his voice shaking with emotion. I care that my wife and son are alive. I care that Clara sat with Maria for 12 hours, never giving up, never stopping, until they were both safe. That's not someone playing at medicine. That's a healer with a calling. More voices joined in, a chorus of support and testimony. The widow Chen spoke about how Clara had sat with her husband through his final night, easing his pain and giving him dignity in death. Tommy's mother talked about difficult births and childhood illnesses treated with competence and care. Even old Mr. Henderson admitted that Clara had saved his life when he'd had a heart episode last spring, and Pritchard had been too drunk to respond. Through it all, Clara sat silent, tears streaming down her face, and Nathaniel held her hand and felt his heart swell with pride. This woman, his woman, had been serving this community with everything she had while asking nothing in return, and now, finally, people were recognizing what she was worth. When the testimonials ended, the mayor called for a vote. All in favor of appointing Clara Bennett as Copper Hollow's primary physician, with full authority to practice medicine and the town's official backing, say aye. The ayes were thunderous, unanimous. No one voted against. Clara stood on shaking legs, and Nathaniel stood with her, his arm around her waist supporting her. She looked out at the room full of neighbors and friends and patients, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Thank you, all of you. I promise I'll serve this community with everything I have for as long as you'll have me. I'll do my best to deserve this trust. She paused, wiping her eyes. And I promise to continue my education, to stay current with medical advances, to consult with other physicians when cases are beyond my experience. I may not have formal credentials, but I'll hold myself to the highest standards anyway. The meeting ended with handshakes and congratulations, and as they walked out into the cold December night, Nathaniel pulled Clara into his arms and held her tight, while she shook with relief and joy and the release of 2 years of frustration. You did it, he murmured into her hair. You're a real doctor now, official and everything. I'm still not a real doctor, she said, but she was smiling through her tears. Not technically, but maybe I don't need to be. Maybe being a good healer is enough. It's more than enough. Nathaniel pulled back to look at her face, flushed with cold and emotion and beautiful in the lamplight. Clara Bennett, you are extraordinary, and I'm so damn proud of you I could burst. She laughed, that sound he loved, and kissed him. Just a brief press of lips, spontaneous and joyful, but it was their first kiss, and it felt like a promise. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. Take me home, Nathaniel, to the ranch. I don't want to be alone tonight. He understood what she was asking, not impropriety, but companionship, someone to share this moment with, someone who understood what it meant. Are you sure? People will talk. Let them. She said it with such confidence, such certainty, that Nathaniel could only nod and help her into the wagon. They rode through the darkness to his ranch, and when they arrived, Clara looked at the house. His mother's house, his house, maybe someday their house, with something like wonder. I've missed this place, she said softly. All those times I came to visit your mother, I felt at home here, peaceful, like I belonged. You do belong. Nathaniel helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist. You belong here, Clara, with me, if you want to. I want to. She looked up at him, and in the moonlight her face was open and honest and everything he'd been looking for without knowing it. Nathaniel, I think I'm falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since the day you rode back into town looking lost and broken and determined. I tried not to. It seemed too fast, too risky, but I can't help it. His heart was hammering so hard he could barely hear over it. I know I'm falling in love with you. Hell, I might already be there. Every day I wake up and think about seeing you. Every night I go to sleep thinking about your smile. You've become the reason I'm staying, the reason I'm building something here instead of just existing. Clara reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle. Then let's not waste any more time being cautious. Life's too short and too uncertain. I learned that when I lost Jacob and my father. If we have a chance at something real, we should take it. I'm going to marry you, Nathaniel said, the words coming out before he'd planned them, but feeling absolutely right. Maybe not tomorrow or next week, but soon. I'm going to marry you, Clara Bennett, and spend the rest of my life making sure you know how extraordinary you are. That's quite a promise. It's not a promise. It's a certainty. He kissed her then, properly, his arms tight around her and her body warm against his in the cold night air. It was a kiss that held everything, hope and desire and commitment and the beginning of forever. When they finally went inside, they sat up until nearly dawn just talking, making plans, dreaming out loud about the future they could build together. Clara wanted to expand her medical practice, maybe convert part of the ranch into a proper clinic. Nathaniel wanted to restore the ranch to what it had been when his grandfather was alive, make it prosperous again, build something worth passing down. Together, they wanted a life of purpose and partnership, of serving their community and raising a family and growing old in this place they both loved. As the sun started to lighten the sky, Clara reluctantly said she should go home before her absence became too scandalous. Nathaniel drove her back to town through the pearl gray dawn, and at her door she kissed him once more, soft and lingering. "I meant what I said last night," she told him, "about falling in love with you, about wanting to build something together." "So did I, every word." Nathaniel held her close for one more moment. "Clara, I'm going to do this right. Court you properly, ask for your hand the way you deserve, give you time to be sure. But know that in my heart, you're already mine and I'm already yours." "I know." She smiled up at him. "And I'm sure, Nathaniel, I've never been more sure of anything." The next weeks were a blur of activity and happiness. Clara threw herself into establishing her practice officially, cleaning out her father's old clinic and setting up a proper examination room. Nathaniel helped her move furniture and build shelves and hang a shingle that read, "Clara Bennett, Physician." It wasn't quite accurate. She still didn't have formal credentials, but it was what the town had voted for, and no one was going to argue. Dr. Pritchard left town quietly one morning, his few belongings packed in a wagon, his shame evident in his hunched shoulders. Clara watched him go with more pity than anger. She understood how easy it was to lose yourself when grief and loneliness closed in. She'd almost done it herself after Jacob died. The difference was she'd found a way back. Pritchard hadn't. Meanwhile, Nathaniel was making his own changes. He hired 2 ranch hands to help with the heavy work, freeing up his time to focus on expansion and improvement. He bought a small herd of cattle from Tommy Morrison and began rebuilding the Cole Ranch into something his grandfather would have been proud of. Every fence he mended, every field he cleared, every building he repaired felt like an act of redemption, a way of honoring his mother's faith in him. And through it all, he courted Clara with old-fashioned intentionality that made the town's romantic hearts sing. Sunday rides through the countryside, Wednesday afternoon picnics when weather permitted, Saturday evenings at her house playing chess. She was getting better, and talking about everything under the sun. He brought her flowers when he could find them in the winter landscape. She cooked him meals that weren't quite as good as his mother's, but improved with practice. They fell into each other's lives so naturally that soon it was hard to remember what it had been like before. Christmas came with snow and celebration, and on Christmas Eve, Nathaniel asked Clara to take a walk with him after the church service. They bundled up against the cold and walked through the quiet town, their breath-making clouds in the air, their gloved hands clasped together. "I have something for you," Nathaniel said when they reached the cemetery. "I wanted to give it to you here, with my family as witnesses." Clara looked around at the snow-covered graves, the moonlight turning everything silver, and understood. This was where his journey home had really begun, standing at his mother's grave and reading her letter. This was where he'd realized he could build a new life. This was sacred ground. Nathaniel led her to the coal plot and pulled a small box from his pocket. When he opened it, Clara gasped. Inside was a ring, simple gold with a small emerald that caught the moonlight and threw it back in green fire. "This was my grandmother's," Nathaniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "My grandfather gave it to her when they were married in 1848. It's been in the Cole family for 3 generations, passed from mother to daughter or daughter-in-law. My mother wore it for 40 years. When she died, it was in her jewelry box with a note that said, 'For Nathaniel's bride, whoever she may be.'" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Nathaniel." "She knew," he continued. "Somehow she knew I'd come back and find someone worth staying for. And she wanted that woman to have this ring, to know she was welcomed into this family, to understand that the Cole women were strong and brave and built to last." He took the ring from the box and held it up, his hand steady despite the importance of the moment. "Clara Bennett, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner and the person I build this life with? Will you let me love you for whatever time we're given? And will you love me back, broken pieces and all?" "Yes." The word came out on a sob of joy. "Yes, Nathaniel Cole, I will marry you. I will love you and partner with you and build this life together. Nothing would make me happier." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for her, and then he was kissing her deep and thorough, sealing the promise between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, Clara held up her hand to watch the emerald sparkle in the moonlight. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "and the fact that your mother meant it for me, that means everything. She would have loved you, Nathaniel pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her against the cold. The way you care for people? The way you give everything you have to help others? The way you're brave enough to take risks for what matters? That's exactly the kind of woman she hoped I'd find. They stood there in the snow, surrounded by the sleeping dead, and made promises for the living. They'd marry in the spring when the wildflowers bloomed. They'd live at the ranch and turn Claire's house into a full-time clinic. They'd serve Copper Hollow together, doctor and rancher, partners in everything. They'd honor the past while building the future. They'd love each other fiercely and well for as long as they both lived. Walking back through town, they passed the Morrison house where Tommy and Sarah were hosting Christmas Eve dinner, and Tommy spotted them through the window. When he saw Clara's hand in Nathaniel's and the ring catching the lamplight, he let out a whoop that probably woke half the town and dragged them both inside to celebrate. Within minutes, it seemed like everyone in Copper Hollow knew that Nathaniel Cole and Clara Bennett were engaged. People appeared from nowhere bearing congratulations and well wishes, slapping Nathaniel on the back and embracing Clara with tears and laughter. Mrs. Morrison cried and said it was about time. Reverend Thomas beamed and said he'd be honored to perform the ceremony. Even crusty Mr. Henderson cracked a rare smile and said the town was better for having them both. It was past midnight when they finally escaped the celebration, and Nathaniel walked Clara home through streets now silent and peaceful. At her door, she turned to him with her face glowing with happiness. "This is the best Christmas I've had since my father died," she said softly. "Thank you for that. Thank you for coming home and finding me and being brave enough to stay. Thank you for giving me a reason to stay, for seeing something in me worth loving." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her lips. "Get some sleep, future Mrs. Cole. We've got a lifetime ahead of us to plan." "A lifetime," Clara repeated, like she was testing the word. I like the sound of that. The winter passed in a haze of wedding preparations and daily life. Clara's practice grew as word spread about the woman doctor who cared more about healing than payment, who made house calls in the middle of the night and never turned anyone away. Nathaniel's ranch thrived under his dedicated management, the cattle multiplying, the land responding to care after years of neglect. They saw each other every day, stealing moments between their separate responsibilities, learning each other's rhythms and habits and quirks. Nathaniel discovered that Clara sang while she worked, old hymns mostly, and that she could curse like a sailor when something frustrated her. Clara learned that Nathaniel woke before dawn every morning to watch the sunrise, that he talked to his horses like they were people, and that he could make her laugh harder than anyone she'd ever known. Their courtship wasn't without challenges. There were difficult conversations about money and expectations, about faith and family, about the practical realities of merging two independent lives. Clara worried about losing her identity as a physician, about becoming just someone's wife. Nathaniel worried about being enough, about whether a former drifter could ever truly become the stable partner she deserved. But they worked through each concern with honesty and patience, learning to communicate and compromise, building the foundation of trust and respect that would carry them through harder times ahead. And through it all, their love deepened from that initial rush of attraction into something more solid and enduring. Not just passion, though there was plenty of that, but genuine partnership. It was late February when Clara discovered she was treating a smallpox case. A traveling merchant had brought it into town, and before anyone realized what it was, 3 families had been exposed. Clara immediately instituted a quarantine and started vaccination protocols, but it was a race against time to prevent an outbreak. Nathaniel wanted to help, but Clara refused to let him come near the infected areas. "You haven't been vaccinated," she said firmly when he argued. "I won't risk you. I've already lost one man I loved to careless tragedy. I won't lose another." So he stayed away from the quarantine but threw himself into supporting her in other ways. He delivered supplies to the quarantined homes, leaving them on doorsteps so Clara could retrieve them safely. He organized the town's response, coordinating food and medicine deliveries, making sure families in quarantine didn't suffer financially. He stayed up late every night waiting for Clara to come home. She was sleeping at the clinic to avoid potentially spreading infection, just to see her tired face through the window and know she was all right. The outbreak lasted 3 weeks, and by the grace of God and Clara's quick action, only 2 people died, the merchant who'd brought it in and an elderly woman whose health was already failing. It could have been so much worse. The town knew it, and their gratitude toward Clara was immense. But the cost to her was visible. When the quarantine finally lifted and Clara came home, she collapsed in Nathaniel's arms and cried for an hour straight, releasing 3 weeks of tension and fear and exhaustion. He held her through it, carried her to bed when she finally fell asleep, and sat watching over her until she woke 12 hours later. "I almost lost you," he said when her eyes opened. "If you'd caught it." "I didn't." Her voice was hoarse from crying. "I was careful. But Nathaniel, I was so scared. Not just for myself, but for all of them. What if I'd made the wrong call? What if more people had died because I wasn't good enough?" "You were more than good enough. You saved this town." He brushed hair back from her face. "But Clara, you can't carry all of it alone. You have to let people help. You have to let me help." "I know." She laced her fingers through his. "I'm still learning how to do that. To accept support instead of just giving it." "Then learn with me. Let me be your partner in this, not just in our personal life, but in everything." Nathaniel's voice was intense. "Your work is important, maybe the most important thing happening in this town. But you're important too, and I need you to take care of yourself so I don't lose you before we've even had our life together." Clara nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks again. "I promise, I'll try. It's just hard when people are counting on me." "They're counting on both of us now. You're not alone anymore." He kissed her, soft and reassuring. "We're a team, remember? For better or worse. Sickness and health. All of it. We're not married yet," she pointed out with a watery smile. "Doesn't matter. Those vows started the moment you said yes. Everything from here is just making it official." Spring arrived finally, bringing warmth and color back to the world. The wildflowers Clara had wanted for her wedding bloomed across the meadows in waves of purple and yellow and white, and the date they'd chosen, April 15th, a Saturday, dawned clear and perfect, like even the weather approved. The wedding was held at the church with seemingly the entire town in attendance. Tommy stood up as Nathaniel's best man, grinning like this was the best day of his life, too. Sarah served as Clara's maid of honor, beautiful in rose-colored silk and crying happy tears from the moment Clara appeared in her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit and still beautiful after 30 years. Nathaniel stood at the altar watching Clara walk down the aisle on Reverend Thomas's arm. She had no father to give her away, so the Reverend had volunteered and felt his throat close with emotion. She was radiant, glowing with joy, and when she reached him and took his hand, Nathaniel knew with absolute certainty that everything he'd been through, every mistake and hardship and year of wandering, had been leading him to this moment. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, traditional vows spoken with modern conviction. Nathaniel promised to love and cherish Clara, to support her calling as a physician, to be her partner in all things. Clara promised the same, adding her own vow to help him continue healing from his past and building his future. They exchanged rings, the emerald on her finger, a simple gold band on his. And when Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared felt like coming home. The reception was held at the community hall, the same place where they danced together that first time. There was food and music and laughter, toasts from Tommy and Sarah and half the town, dancing until the sun went down and the lanterns came up. At one point, Nathaniel found himself standing with Clara in the center of the floor, swaying to a slow song, surrounded by everyone who mattered. "Happy?" he murmured against her hair. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be again," she whispered back. "Thank you for finding me, Nathaniel. Thank you for staying. Thank you for giving me something to stay for, someone to stay for." He pulled back to look at her face, flushed and beautiful, and his. "I love you, Clara Cole." "I love you too." She beamed at the sound of her new name. "Now take me home, husband. Our life is waiting." They left the reception to cheers and well wishes, riding together in a decorated wagon toward the ranch that was now officially theirs, starting the journey that would carry them through years of joy and challenge, through children and grandchildren, through a lifetime of service and partnership and love. Nathaniel had ridden back to Copper Hollow for a funeral, expecting to stay only long enough to settle affairs and leave again. Instead, he'd found a reason to build a life. He'd found healing and purpose and community. Most importantly, he'd found Clara, the woman who'd believed in him before he believed in himself, who'd welcomed him home and made him want to deserve her. His mother had been right about everything. Sometimes you had to lose it all to find what really mattered. Sometimes going home was the bravest thing you could do, and sometimes the woman you needed was right there waiting, if you were just brave enough to stay and find her. As they drove through the night toward their future, Nathaniel looked up at the stars wheeling overhead and sent a silent thank you to his mother. She'd known. Somehow, she'd known that Clara Bennett would be his salvation, his home, his everything, and she'd made sure he knew it too. The ranch house was dark when they arrived, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like the beginning of something beautiful, something lasting, something worth every hard mile it had taken to get here. Nathaniel carried Clara over the threshold. Tradition mattered, even to a former drifter, and set her down gently in the front room that had once belonged to his mother and now belonged to them. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cole," he said softly. Clara smiled up at him, her eyes bright with love and promise. "Welcome home, Mr. Cole. Let's build something extraordinary together." And they did. Their first year of marriage unfolded like a story Nathaniel hadn't known he was allowed to want. Every morning he woke to find Clara beside him, her hair spread across the pillow like spilled honey, her face soft with sleep, and every morning it felt like a minor miracle that she'd chosen him, that she was his. They fell into rhythms that felt both new and ancient, morning coffee together before she left for the clinic, evening meals where they shared the details of their days, nights spent talking or reading or simply sitting in comfortable silence while the fire burned low. The ranch thrived under Nathaniel's careful stewardship. The cattle herd grew, the fences stayed mended, the buildings got repaired and improved until the place looked better than it had in 20 years. He hired good men who respected the land and the animals, and slowly the Cole Ranch became known again as a place of quality stock and honest dealing. Money was still tight sometimes, but they were making it work, building something sustainable and real. Clara's medical practice flourished beyond anyone's expectations, including her own. Word spread about the woman doctor in Copper Hollow who could treat anything from routine ailments to serious injuries, who made house calls at all hours and never turned away someone who couldn't pay. She delivered babies and set bones and sat with the dying, and through it all she maintained a grace and competence that made people trust her with their lives and the lives of their children. But it wasn't easy, balancing her calling with her marriage. There were nights when Nathaniel ate supper alone because Clara was with a patient in crisis. Mornings when he woke to an empty bed because she'd been called out in the middle of the night. Days when he barely saw her at all, when her work consumed every hour and left her exhausted and wrung out. He never complained, never made her feel guilty, but Clara saw the loneliness in his eyes sometimes, and it broke her heart a little. It was late summer when everything shifted again. Clara had been feeling off for weeks, tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, queasy in the mornings, emotional over small things. She'd ignored it at first, chalking it up to a busy practice and the August heat. But when her monthly courses didn't come, and then didn't come again, she finally allowed herself to consider the possibility that had been dancing at the edge of her consciousness. She examined herself with the same clinical detachment she'd use with any patient, checking all the signs and symptoms, and when the evidence became undeniable, she sat in her clinic with tears streaming down her face and a hand pressed to her still flat belly. A baby. She was carrying a baby. Their baby. The joy was immediate and overwhelming, but so was the fear. She'd lost Jacob just months after their wedding, before they'd had a chance to start a family. This was her second chance at motherhood, at building the life she dreamed of, and the thought of something going wrong was paralyzing. What if she lost this baby? What if there were complications? What if she wasn't strong enough or good enough or lucky enough to carry this pregnancy to term? She sat there for an hour, cycling through every emotion, before finally pulling herself together enough to go home and tell Nathaniel. She found him in the barn, grooming Blue, and when he looked up and saw her face, joy and terror mixed together, he immediately set down the brush and came to her. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No, Clara took a shaky breath. "I'm pregnant, Nathaniel. We're going to have a baby." The expression that crossed his face was so full of wonder and happiness that Clara started crying again, and then they were both laughing and crying and holding each other while Blue watched with patient equine confusion. "A baby," Nathaniel kept saying, like he couldn't quite believe it. "We're going to have a baby. When? How far along?" "About 8 weeks, I think. Which means the baby should come in late February or early March." Clara pulled back to look at his face. Are you happy? Really happy? I know we didn't plan this, not so soon. Happy? Clara, I'm... He stopped, apparently unable to find words big enough. Instead, he kissed her, deep and thorough, his hands gentle on her waist like she was made of glass. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were wet. I didn't think I'd ever get to have this. A wife, a home, a child on the way. 8 years ago, I was drifting from town to town with nothing and no one, and now I have everything that matters. So yes, I'm happy. I'm terrified and overwhelmed and completely unprepared, but I'm so damn happy I could shout it from the roof. Please don't do that. The neighbors will think you've lost your mind. I have. Lost my mind, lost my heart, lost any sense of self-preservation. He grinned at her, that crooked smile she loved. All of it belongs to you now, you and this baby. Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. That she could have this happiness without it being taken away. That the universe owed her this much, at least, after everything she'd lost. The pregnancy was harder than she'd expected. The morning sickness lasted well into her 4th month, leaving her weak and dehydrated and miserable. Her body ached in new and creative ways. The exhaustion was bone deep and relentless. And through it all, she tried to maintain her practice, to be available for the people who needed her, even when what she really wanted was to curl up in bed and sleep for a week. Nathaniel watched her run herself ragged and finally put his foot down in October, when he found her passed out at her desk at the clinic after a 30-hour shift with a difficult birth. "This stops now," he said, his voice tight with fear and anger. "Clara, you're going to hurt yourself. You're going to hurt the baby. You have to slow down." "I can't." She was crying from exhaustion and frustration. "These people need me, Nathaniel. Mrs. Chen's pneumonia, the Miller boy's broken arm, Sarah Morrison's difficult pregnancy. I'm the only doctor for 20 miles. I can't just stop." "Then we get help. We find someone to assist you, someone who can take some of the load." He knelt beside her chair and took her hands. "Please, Clara, I'm begging you. I can't lose you. I can't lose this baby. You're everything to me, and watching you work yourself to death is killing me." His words, raw with genuine terror, finally penetrated the fog of her exhaustion. Clara looked at her husband, this man who'd ridden back into town broken and alone, who'd rebuilt himself into someone strong and steady and present, and saw the fear in his eyes. The same fear she carried every day about losing what they'd built, about not being good enough or strong enough or lucky enough to keep it. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, you're right. I need help. We'll figure something out." They did, through a series of small miracles and community support. Sarah Morrison, who'd been helping occasionally already, agreed to train as Clara's official assistant. Tommy's younger sister, Jane, who'd always been interested in medicine, started apprenticing with Clara 3 days a week. And the town, recognizing that their doctor was pregnant and needed support, organized a rotation of women to help with non-medical tasks, cleaning the clinic, organizing supplies, running messages. With help in place, Clara finally allowed herself to slow down, to accept that she couldn't do everything alone, that accepting support wasn't weakness, but wisdom. She started leaving the clinic by dinner time most evenings. She took Sundays off completely. She learned to delegate and trust others with tasks she'd always insisted on doing herself. And gradually, the exhaustion lifted enough for her to actually enjoy the pregnancy, to feel the flutter of movement as the baby grew, to watch her belly swell with new life, to imagine the future they were creating. She and Nathaniel spent winter evenings talking about names and nursery arrangements and what kind of parents they wanted to be. They moved furniture around in the spare room, transforming it from storage space to a proper nursery with a cradle. Nathaniel built himself and curtains Clara sewed by lamplight. "Boy or girl, do you think?" Nathaniel asked one night in January, his hand spread across Clara's belly where the baby was doing acrobatics. "Does it matter?" "Not even a little, though I confess I don't know the first thing about raising a daughter. Boys, I understand. I was one. But girls are mysterious creatures." Clara laughed. Says the man who married a woman doctor, "I don't think you're as mystified by females as you claim." "I'm mystified by you specifically, but in the best possible way." He leaned down and kissed her belly, talking to the baby through the fabric of her nightgown. Your mother is the strongest, smartest, most stubborn person I've ever met. You're going to be extraordinary, whoever you turn out to be. The baby kicked in response, and they both laughed, marveling at this tiny person they'd made together, this tangible proof that broken people could heal and build something beautiful. Labor started on a cold morning in late February, 3 weeks before Clara's due date. She woke with the first contractions just before dawn and lay there for a while, breathing through them, assessing their strength and frequency with clinical detachment before the reality hit her. She was about to give birth. She was about to become a mother. After everything, after Jacob's death and her father's passing and years of loneliness, she was finally going to have the family she'd dreamed of. Nathaniel. She shook his shoulder gently. Nathaniel, wake up. It's time. He came awake instantly, going from sleep to full alertness in seconds. Time? The baby? Now? Contractions are about 10 minutes apart. We have time, but we should get to the clinic. Her voice was remarkably steady considering her heart was racing. And Nathaniel? I need you to stay calm. I need you to be strong for me because I'm terrified and trying very hard not to show it. His face softened immediately. He cupped her cheek in his palm and looked into her eyes with such love and confidence that some of her fear eased. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. You've delivered dozens of babies, Clara. You know what to expect. You can do this. Knowing and doing are different things, but she managed a shaky smile. Help me up. We need to go before these contractions get worse. They made it to the clinic just as the sun was rising, painting the snow-covered town in shades of rose and gold. Sarah was already there. Clara had sent word the night before that labor was imminent, and she took one look at Clara's face and immediately shifted into efficient assistant mode. How far apart? She asked, helping Clara into the examination room. 8 minutes now. They're getting stronger. Clara gritted her teeth through another contraction, breathing the way she'd coached countless other women to breathe. It helped, but not enough. God, it hurt more than she'd expected. The next hours passed in a haze of pain and effort and Nathaniel's steady presence. He held her hand when the contractions peaked, wiped her face with cool cloths, talked her through the worst moments with the same calm voice he used with spooked horses. Claire had always known he was strong, but this was different. This was emotional strength, the ability to be exactly what she needed when she needed it most. Sarah handled the medical aspects with competence that would have made Clara proud if she'd been capable of thinking about anything beyond the monumental task of bringing a human being into the world. Between contractions, Clara gave terse instructions about what to watch for, what to do if complications arose, but mostly she just surrendered to the process and trusted her body to know what it was doing. Labor lasted 14 hours. Not especially long for a first baby, but feeling endless in the moment. By the time Clara felt the overwhelming urge to push, she was exhausted and hurting and ready for this to be over. But when Sarah told her she could see the baby's head, when Nathaniel's grip tightened on her hand and his voice broke saying, "You're almost there, Clara, almost there," she found reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. 3 more contractions, 3 agonizing pushes, and then suddenly there was a baby, tiny and red and screaming with impressive lung power, and Sarah was saying, "It's a boy. Clara, you have a son." A son. They had a son. Clara was crying and reaching for the baby before Sarah had even finished cleaning him up. When her son was finally placed on her chest, still crying and squirming and absolutely perfect, Clara felt something in her soul slot into place. This was what she'd been waiting for. This was what all the pain and fear and years of loss had been leading to. This impossibly small person with Nathaniel's dark hair and her nose and lungs that worked far too well. "Hello, little one," she whispered, running her finger along his tiny cheek. "Welcome to the world. We've been waiting for you." Nathaniel was crying too, his face wet with tears as he leaned over to look at his son. "He's perfect. Clara, he's absolutely perfect." "He is." She looked up at her husband, this man who'd found his way home and become her everything. "What should we call him?" They'd discussed names extensively, but never quite decided. Now, looking at this tiny person who'd already changed their entire world, Nathaniel said, "What about Samuel James, after my brother and my father?" Clara's heart squeezed. Naming the baby after the family Nathaniel had lost felt like healing, like honoring the past while building the future. Samuel James Cole. I love it. Samuel, Nathaniel said softly, touching his son's tiny fist, which immediately wrapped around his finger with surprising strength. Welcome home, Sam. Your grandfather and uncle would have loved you. The baby, Samuel, stopped crying and seemed to focus on Nathaniel's voice, his dark eyes trying to track the sound. It was probably just reflex, Clara knew, but it felt like recognition, like this tiny person already knew his father's voice and was reassured by it. Over the next few days, they settled into the exhausting, overwhelming, wonderful chaos of new parenthood. Samuel ate every 2 hours, cried when he was hungry or wet, or simply because he felt like it, and slept in unpredictable bursts that left both Clara and Nathaniel stumbling through the days in a fog of sleeplessness. But even through the exhaustion, the joy was undeniable. Nathaniel took to fatherhood with the same steady competence he brought to everything else. He learned to change diapers without complaint, walked the floor with a crying baby at 3 a.m. singing off-key lullabies, and looked at his son with such wonder and love that Clara fell in love with him all over again. This was what she'd wanted, a partner who showed up, who did the hard work, who loved their child as fiercely as she did. The town came out in force to support them. Tommy and Sarah brought meals and offered to watch Samuel so Clara and Nathaniel could sleep. Mrs. Morrison knitted tiny sweaters and blankets. Even Mr. Henderson stopped by with a savings bond for Samuel's future education. The community that had welcomed Nathaniel home and supported Clara's medical practice now wrapped around their small family with warmth and care. But Clara struggled more than she'd expected. She loved Samuel desperately, would die for him without hesitation, but the reality of motherhood was harder than anything she'd experienced. The constant demands, the interrupted sleep, the way her body still hurt from childbirth, the overwhelming responsibility of keeping this tiny person alive. It all pressed down on her until some days she felt like she couldn't breathe. And then there was the guilt. She'd cut back her medical practice significantly, seeing only emergency cases and routine appointments she couldn't reschedule. But every time someone came to the door needing help, and she had to say she wasn't available, every time she heard about someone going without care because she was busy with the baby, the guilt gnawed at her. She was a doctor. People needed her. How could she choose her own child over patients who might suffer without her help? Nathaniel found her crying in the nursery one night, about 6 weeks after Samuel's birth, holding their sleeping son and sobbing quietly so as not to wake him. Clara? Sweetheart, what's wrong? He was beside her in an instant, his hand on her back, his voice full of concern. I can't do this. The words burst out of her in a rush. I can't be a good mother and a good doctor. There aren't enough hours in the day. There's not enough of me to go around. I'm failing at both, and I don't know how to fix it. You're not failing at anything. Nathaniel's voice was firm. Clara, you're 6 weeks postpartum. You're exhausted and your body's still healing and your hormones are all over the place. Of course, everything feels impossible right now. It's not just hormones. She looked down at Samuel, his tiny face relaxed in sleep, completely trusting that they'd keep him safe. I love him so much it terrifies me, but I also miss my work. I miss feeling competent and useful. I miss being someone other than just Samuel's mother. Does that make me a terrible person? It makes you human. Nathaniel carefully took Samuel from her arms and laid him in the cradle, then pulled Clara to her feet and wrapped his arms around her. Listen to me. You don't have to choose between being a mother and being a doctor. You can be both. It'll be hard and messy, and you'll feel like you're doing everything halfway, but you can do it. We can do it. How? We figure it out together. We get more help with the practice, maybe hire a nurse full-time, someone who can handle routine cases so you only have to deal with the complicated stuff. We ask Sarah and Tommy to watch Samuel sometimes so you can work without feeling torn. We accept that some days you'll be a better doctor than mother, some days you'll be a better mother than doctor, and most days you'll be good enough at both, and that has to be okay. Clara pressed her face against his chest and let herself cry it out, all the fear and guilt and overwhelming love and exhaustion. Nathaniel held her through it, solid and steady as always, and when she finally pulled back and wiped her eyes, she felt marginally better. I'm sorry, she said. I know this isn't what you signed up for, a wife who falls apart every other week. I signed up for you. All of you, including the parts that struggle and doubt and occasionally fall apart. He kissed her forehead. And for the record, you're the strongest person I know. The fact that you're having a hard time adjusting to motherhood doesn't change that. It just makes you human. They worked on solutions together, finding ways to balance Clara's calling with her new role as a mother. She started taking Samuel to the clinic with her for routine appointments, letting him sleep in a cradle in the corner while she worked. She trained Jane and Sarah to handle more complex cases under her supervision. She learned to accept help without guilt, to recognize that asking for support wasn't weakness but wisdom. Gradually, over the spring and into summer, they found their rhythm. It wasn't perfect. Some days were still overwhelming. Some nights Samuel screamed for hours and they both wanted to cry along with him. But they were managing, more than managing. They were building a life that honored all the parts of who they were: partners, parents, physician, rancher, members of a community that needed them both. Samuel grew from a helpless newborn into a curious infant who smiled at everything and everyone, who reached for shiny objects with chubby fists, who laughed when Nathaniel tossed him in the air, and cooed when Clara sang to him. He looked like both of them, and neither of them, his own small person with his own personality already emerging. On Samuel's first birthday in February, they threw a party at the ranch with half the town in attendance. Clara watched Nathaniel hold their son while Samuel destroyed a small cake with enthusiastic determination, getting more on his face than in his mouth, and felt her heart swell with gratitude. This life, this messy, imperfect, beautiful life, was more than she'd ever dared to hope for. "Thank you," she said to Nathaniel later that night, after Samuel was asleep and the house was quiet again. "For what?" "For coming home. For staying. For building this with me." She gestured around them at the home they'd created together. "A year ago, I was worried I couldn't do both, be a doctor and a mother. Now I know I can, but only because you're beside me making it possible." Nathaniel pulled her close and kissed her, slow and sweet. "We make it possible together. That's what partnership means." The years that followed brought their share of challenges and joys. Clara's practice continued to grow, and eventually they built a proper clinic building in town with examination rooms and space for overnight patients. Nathaniel's ranch became one of the most respected in the territory, known for quality cattle and honest dealing. Samuel grew into a bright, curious boy who loved horses like his father and asked endless questions about medicine like his mother. And then there were more babies. A daughter named Rose Margaret, born when Samuel was 3, named for Clara's mother and Nathaniel's. Twin boys 2 years later, Jacob and Thomas, named for Clara's lost husband and the Reverend who'd guided them both home. Each birth was easier than the last, and each child added new dimension to their family, new chaos and new love. The house that had felt so empty when Nathaniel first returned filled with the sounds of children laughing and arguing and playing. The ranch that his grandfather had built became a place where generations gathered, where the past and present and future all wove together into something lasting. The town that had nearly lost its doctor got a medical legacy instead, as Clara trained young people interested in healing and established a practice that would serve Copper Hollow for decades to come. There were hard times, too. Droughts that threatened the ranch, disease outbreaks that pushed Clara to her limits, the normal struggles of marriage and child-rearing and building a life from imperfect materials. But through it all, Nathaniel and Clara held to the promises they'd made to each other, to be partners, to show up, to love each other fiercely even when it was hard. It was 20 years after Nathaniel had first ridden back into Copper Hollow when he found himself standing in the cemetery again, this time with Clara beside him and their 4 children arrayed around them. They'd come to visit the family graves, as they did every year on the anniversary of his mother's death, bringing flowers and stories and proof that her faith in him had been justified. Samuel, now a strapping young man of 19 studying to be a veterinarian, stood tall and serious. Rose, 16 and already showing signs of her mother's medical skill, held little Thomas's hand to keep him still. Jacob, the quieter twin, leaned against his father's side. They were good children, these 4, raised with love and discipline and the understanding that they were part of something larger than themselves, a family, a community, a legacy worth honoring. "Tell us about Grandmother Margaret again," Rose said, as she always did when they came here. It was her favorite story, the one about how her father had come home broken and found healing. how her mother had welcomed him without judgment, how they'd built this life together from loss and second chances. So Nathaniel told it again, the way he'd told it 100 times before, adding details he remembered and lessons he'd learned. About his mother's letter that had given him permission to stay, about Clara bringing food and flowers and hope when he'd needed it most, about the dance where he'd first dared to imagine a future worth having, about the choice he'd made to stop running and start building. The point, he said, looking at his children's faces, so young, so full of possibility, is that it's never too late to come home, never too late to make different choices, never too late to find what you're looking for, if you're brave enough to stop and look around. Clara squeezed his hand and he looked down at her, older now, with threads of silver in her hair and lines around her eyes from 20 years of smiling and worrying and living fully. She was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, still the reason he got up every morning, grateful for another day. No regrets? She asked quietly, a question she'd asked him many times over the years. Not a single one. And it was true. Every hard mile, every mistake, every year of wandering had led him here, to this place, to this woman, to this life. He wouldn't change any of it, because changing the past would mean losing the present, and the present was everything he'd ever wanted. They walked back through town as the sun was setting, their children running ahead, and Nathaniel looked at Copper Hollow with eyes that saw not just what it was, but what it meant. This town had rejected him once, when he'd left in anger and shame, but it had welcomed him back with open arms when he'd returned broken and seeking redemption. It had given him work and community and purpose. Most importantly, it had given him Clara, the woman who'd made him believe in second chances. At their house, the house that had been his mother's and grandfather's, now filled with their own family's laughter and love, they gathered for dinner around a table Nathaniel had built with his own hands. Clara said grace, thanking God for the food and the family and the ordinary miracle of another day together. The children dug into their meal with the casual enthusiasm of people who'd never known real hunger or loneliness. And Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, looking at the faces of the people he loved, and felt a peace so deep it bordered on prayer. He'd spent 8 years searching for something he couldn't name, running from a past that hurt too much to face. He'd needed to lose everything to understand what truly mattered. He'd needed to come home to finally stop running. His mother had been right in her letter. Life wasn't about avoiding pain or pretending the past didn't exist. It was about facing what hurt, learning from it, and building something better with the pieces that remained. It was about forgiveness, of others and of yourself. It was about having the courage to stay when staying was hard, to love when love was risky, to build when building seemed impossible. Nathaniel Cole had ridden home for a funeral and found a life worth living. He'd come back broken and been made whole by a woman with healing hands and a generous heart. He'd been lost and was found. He'd been alone and now belonged to something bigger than himself, a family, a community, a legacy of service and love. Sometimes he knew the bravest thing you could do was simply stay. Stay when you wanted to run. Stay when it hurt. Stay when you didn't think you deserved it. Stay long enough to build something worth keeping, something worth passing down, something that transformed loss into purpose and pain into love. He'd stayed. Clara had made him want to stay, and together they'd built this, a home, a family, a life that honored both the past they'd lost and the future they were creating. As the evening stretched into night and the children were finally settled in bed, Nathaniel and Clara stood together on the porch, where he'd first seen her bringing food and kindness to a stranger who'd come too late to say goodbye. The stars were bright overhead, the same stars that had watched him drift for 8 years, now witness to his rootedness. "Do you ever miss it?" Clara asked, leaning against him. "The freedom of moving on whenever you wanted? No responsibilities, no one depending on you?" Nathaniel thought about it honestly. "Sometimes I remember the simplicity of it, just me and a horse in the open road. But then I remember the loneliness, the emptiness of belonging nowhere. And I know I wouldn't trade this for anything. This life, this home, you. This is what I was searching for all along. I just didn't know it." "I'm glad you found it, found us." Clara turned in his arms to look up at him. "I'm glad you came home, Nathaniel Cole." "So am I." He kissed her. This woman who'd saved him in every way a person could be saved. Thank you for making me believe I could stay, for making me want to. They stood there together, watching the night deepen over the land they'd built their life on, the house behind them full of sleeping children and the promise of tomorrow. Somewhere in the darkness, cattle lowed softly and horses moved in their stalls. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods like his mother's voice, approving, welcoming, at peace. Nathaniel had come home to bury a mother and had instead found the courage to live. He'd discovered that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about building a future worthy of the second chance he'd been given. He'd learned that love, real love, the lasting kind, was something you chose every day, through the hard times and the good times, through the moments of joy and the moments of struggle. And he'd learned that home wasn't just a place. It was the people you chose to build a life with, the community you served, the legacy you left behind. It was Clara's hand in his and children's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent too long. It was roots growing deep into red earth and branches reaching toward the sky. It was the choice, made new each morning, to stay and build instead of run and hide. Nathaniel Cole had finally found where he belonged. And it was everything, absolutely everything, his mother had hoped it would be. Her letter had been a map leading him home, and Clara had been the destination he'd needed to find. Together, they'd taken his brokenness and her loss and built something beautiful, something lasting, something worth every hard mile it had taken to get here. The cowboy who'd ridden home for a funeral had found the woman who made him believe in life again. And in believing, in staying, in choosing love over fear and home over wandering, he'd finally become the man he was always meant to be, complete, rooted, home at last. And that, Nathaniel knew as he held his wife under the stars that had guided him back, was the only ending that had ever really mattered.